Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 24 years old. This happened in the remote mountains of Garrett County, Maryland, deep in the Savage River State Forest where the ancient Appalachian peaks scrape against a sky that never seems quite right. It was supposed to be a celebration. 4 college friends finally graduated, one last adventure before we scattered to our adult lives like leaves in an autumn wind. Jake Morrison had found this place on some obscure hiking forum, a primitive campsite near Crabtree Creek, miles from any road, accessible only by a narrow trail that wound through dense hemlock forests and across moss-slicked boulders. Completely off-grid, he'd promised with that reckless grin that had gotten us into trouble since freshman year. Just us, the wilderness, and whatever we can carry. Sarah Chen had been hesitant. She was always the practical one, the voice of reason that kept our group tethered to reality. But even she couldn't resist the romantic notion of one final adventure. "Fine," she'd said, adjusting her wire-rimmed glasses with that decisive nod we'd learned meant her mind was made up. "But we do this right. Proper gear, emergency supplies, and we tell someone exactly where we're going." David Torres, our group's self-appointed outdoorsman, had practically vibrated with excitement. He'd been planning gear lists for weeks, researching everything from water purification tablets to the optimal way to hang a bear canister. His enthusiasm was infectious, even if his tendency to overplan sometimes grated on our nerves. The drive from Baltimore had taken us through increasingly rural landscapes, past weathered farmhouses and forests that seemed to press closer to the road with each passing mile. By the time we reached the trailhead, little more than a gravel pullout beside a rusted sign declaring Savage River State Forest, primitive area, the sun was already beginning its descent toward the western ridges. "We should have started earlier," Sarah muttered, checking her GPS watch for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. The device showed a weak signal, 3 bars flickering to 1 and back again. "Relax," Jake said, shouldering his overstuffed pack with characteristic bravado. "It's only a 6-mile hike. We'll be there before dark." That was our first mistake. The trail began innocuously enough, a well-worn path through second-growth forest dotted with interpretive signs about local flora and fauna. But as we climbed higher into the mountains, the forest changed. The modern hardwoods gave way to older growth, massive hemlocks that blocked out most of the sky, their branches draped with hanging moss that swayed in a breeze we couldn't feel at ground level. The air grew thick and humid, carrying scents of decay and something else, something ancient and organic that made the back of my throat itch. "Jesus, it's like a green tunnel," David said, his voice unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. Birds called occasionally from the canopy far above, but their cries seemed muted, distant, as if filtered through layers of cotton. The trail markers became increasingly sparse as we climbed. What had started as clear blazes on trees every 50 yards stretched to 100-yard intervals, then longer gaps that had us backtracking more than once to find the faded paint marks. My phone showed no signal, not even emergency services, and the GPS function seemed confused, our location jumping erratically across the screen like a drunk trying to walk a straight line. "This is taking longer than it should," Sarah said during one of our frequent stops. She'd pulled out her paper map, the old-fashioned kind that outdoor stores still sold to paranoid hikers like us, but as she spread it across a moss-covered log, her frown deepened. "According to this, we should have hit the creek crossing an hour ago." "Maps can be wrong," Jake said, but even his usual confidence seemed strained. Sweat darkened his shirt despite the cool mountain air, and he kept glancing over his shoulder as if expecting something to follow us up the trail. The wrongness started small. A trail junction that wasn't marked on any of our maps or GPS devices. Stone cairns that appeared to have been built recently but were covered in moss that should have taken years to accumulate. tree blazes that seemed to shimmer and change when viewed from different angles, sometimes appearing red, sometimes white, sometimes not there at all. By the time we found Crabtree Creek, the sun was an orange glow filtering through the canopy, and we were all fighting the same creeping anxiety that had been building since we'd entered the deeper forest. The creek itself was wrong too, running black as crude oil despite the clear water that burbled over the stones, reflecting no light from the dying day above. "We need to find the campsite," David said, consulting his compass for the 4th time in 10 minutes. According to Jake's coordinates, it should be just upstream. But when we reached the supposed location, we found only more forest. No cleared space, no fire ring, no evidence that humans had ever set foot in this tangled wilderness. Jake checked and rechecked his phone, scrolling through screenshots of the hiking forum post that had brought us here. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. "The GPS coordinates are exact. We should be standing right on top of it." "Maybe we'll have better luck in the morning," Sarah said, though her voice carried a tremor she was trying to hide. "Let's just find somewhere level to set up camp." We found a small clearing perhaps 100 yards from the creek, a circle of flattened earth surrounded by towering hemlocks that seemed to lean inward like curious giants. The space felt temporary, as if the forest were merely tolerating our presence and might reclaim it at any moment. Setting up camp took longer than it should have. Our headlamps kept flickering despite fresh batteries, and the LED lights seemed to create more shadows than they eliminated. Every time one of us moved outside the circle of dim illumination, they seemed to disappear entirely, swallowed by a darkness that felt almost solid. "Did anyone else notice how quiet it got?" David asked as we gathered around Jake's camp stove for dinner. He was right. The forest sounds that had accompanied our hike had faded to absolute silence. No insects, no night birds, no rustling of small creatures in the underbrush. Even the creek seemed muted, its burbling reduced to a whisper. Sarah pulled her sleeping bag closer around her shoulders. "Maybe we scared off the local wildlife." "Wildlife doesn't just disappear," David said. "There should be something. Mice, bats, insects. This level of silence isn't natural." Jake laughed, but it sounded forced. "You guys are being paranoid. It's just a quiet night in the woods." That's when we heard the first scream. It came from somewhere upstream, a human cry of pure terror that echoed off the mountainsides and seemed to go on forever. We all froze, spoons halfway to our mouths, eyes wide in the dancing light of Jake's camp stove. "What the hell was that?" Sarah whispered. The scream came again, closer this time and definitely human. Someone was in trouble, somewhere out there in the black forest. "We have to help," David said, already reaching for his flashlight. "Help who?" Jake demanded. "We haven't seen another person for hours. There's no one else supposed to be out here." "Someone could be lost, hurt," Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. The scream, when it came again, didn't sound like someone calling for help. It sounded like someone being torn apart. We huddled closer to the stove, its blue flame suddenly seeming pitifully small against the vast darkness that pressed against our little circle of light. The screaming continued sporadically for nearly an hour, sometimes upstream, sometimes down, sometimes seeming to come from directly above us in the canopy. But every time we tried to pinpoint its location, the sound seemed to shift, as if the source were moving impossibly fast through the forest. "Bears," David suggested weakly. "Bears don't scream like that," Jake said. "That was human." Eventually, the cries faded to nothing, leaving us alone with the oppressive silence and the growing certainty that we were not alone in these mountains. We took turns on watch, though what we were watching for, none of us could say. My shift came just after midnight, and I sat hunched over the dying coals of our fire, feeding it twigs and small branches to keep the darkness at bay. That's when I first saw the eyes. They reflected our firelight from perhaps 30 yards away, a pair of amber points floating at shoulder height among the tree trunks. Too high for a deer, too low for a bear standing upright, too steady for any animal I knew. "David," I hissed, shaking him awake. "David, there's something out there." He sat up immediately, following my pointing finger to the spot where I'd seen the eyes. But they were gone, leaving only empty forest and the dance of shadows in our dying firelight. "I don't see anything," he whispered. They were there. Eyes, reflecting the fire. Something big. We fed the fire until it blazed again, pushing back the darkness. But the feeling of being watched never left, a prickling between my shoulder blades that made it impossible to relax. When David took over the watch an hour later, I didn't sleep. None of us did. Dawn came gray and muted, filtered through the heavy canopy until it was barely brighter than dusk. We broke camp quickly, eager to begin the hike back to civilization and the safety of electric lights and cell phone signals. But when we tried to retrace our route, the trail seemed different. Markers we'd passed the day before were gone, replaced by different blazes that led in entirely wrong directions. "This isn't right," Sarah said, studying her compass with increasing frustration. "North should be that way, but the trail is going southeast." "Trails can wind around," Jake said, but he sounded less confident than usual. "Maybe it loops back." We followed the trail for 2 hours, climbing steadily upward through forest that grew darker and more oppressive with each step. The trees here were ancient, their trunks easily 6 feet in diameter, their branches so intertwined above us that virtually no sunlight reached the forest floor. Moss covered everything, trees, rocks, the trail itself, in a soft green carpet that muffled our footsteps and made the forest feel like the interior of some vast, living tomb. It was David who first noticed that his pack felt lighter. "That's impossible," he said, dumping the contents onto the moss-covered ground. "I packed everything myself, double-checked the list." But half his supplies were gone. The emergency radio, most of his food, his backup water purification tablets, items that had been securely stored in zippered compartments, yet showed no sign of tampering. We all checked our packs. Sarah's first aid kit was missing. Jake's backup flashlight had vanished. My emergency blanket had disappeared from a pocket I was certain I'd zipped shut. It was as if the forest itself were slowly consuming our supplies, taking what it needed while we slept. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Something is very wrong with this place." But the trail had other plans. Every path we tried led us deeper into the mountains, higher into the ancient forest where the air grew thin and strange. Our phones showed impossible readings, GPS coordinates that placed us hundreds of miles away, elevation markers that put us below sea level despite clearly climbing upward, timestamps that jumped randomly between past and future. It was during our 3rd hour of futile hiking that Jake suggested we split up. "Just for an hour," he said. "David and I will scout ahead, see if we can find a way down. You and Sarah can look for that creek again, try to backtrack to yesterday's camp." Every survival manual ever written screams against splitting up. But desperation makes people stupid, and we were all beginning to panic. The rational part of my mind knew it was a terrible idea, but the growing certainty that we were lost, truly lost in a way that maps and compasses couldn't fix, made Jake's suggestion seem reasonable. 1 hour, Sarah agreed. "We meet back here no matter what." David checked his watch. 11:30 now. Back here by 12:30, no exceptions. They disappeared into the forest, Jake's orange jacket a brief flash of color before the green darkness swallowed them whole. Sarah and I set off in the opposite direction, following what might have been a game trail toward the sound of running water. We found the creek, or a creek, impossible to tell if it was the same one from our campsite. The water ran black as before, and when Sarah knelt to refill her water bottle, her reflection stared back wrong. Not quite the right proportions, mouth too wide, eyes too dark. "Don't drink that," I said, though I couldn't articulate why. "Let's just head back." But when we tried to return to the meeting spot, the forest had changed again. Trees that should have been familiar landmarks had vanished, replaced by others that seemed subtly wrong, bark that spiraled in impossible directions, branches that formed geometric patterns no natural growth could create. The moss-covered rocks we'd used as waypoints were gone, and the ground itself seemed to shift and flow when we weren't looking directly at it. We were well past 12:30 when we finally found Jake and David, or rather, when Jake found us. He emerged from the forest like a wraith, moving with a strange gliding step that made no sound on the moss-covered ground. His orange jacket was pristine, showing none of the tears and dirt that should have accumulated during hours of bushwhacking through dense undergrowth. "Where's David?" Sarah asked. Jake smiled, and something about that expression made my stomach clench. Too wide, lasting too long, never quite reaching his eyes. "He's waiting for us. Found a way out." "Where?" I demanded. "Just through here." Jake gestured toward a gap between two massive hemlocks, a space I was certain hadn't been there moments before. "Easy, trail down to the parking area. We can be back to the car in an hour." Sarah started to follow, but I grabbed her arm. Something was wrong with Jake's voice. The words were right, the tone conversational, but underneath lay something else. A hunger, vast and patient and utterly inhuman. "Jake," I said carefully, "what did you and David find up there?" His head tilted slightly like a bird studying an insect. "Nothing much, just trees and rocks, same as everywhere else." "You were gone for 3 hours. It's almost 4 o'clock." He blinked slowly, and for just a moment his eyes seemed to reflect light that wasn't there. "Is it? Time moves strangely up here." Sarah was studying him too now, her scientific mind cataloging the subtle wrongness. "Jake, are you feeling all right? You look pale." "I feel wonderful," he said, and that terrible smile stretched wider. "Better than I've felt in years. David feels wonderful too. You should come see." "Where is David?" I pressed. "He's waiting. He wants to show you something." Jake's head tilted further, an angle that would have been painful for a human neck. Something beautiful. I pulled Sarah back, every instinct screaming danger. "We're not going anywhere until we see David." Jake's smile finally faded, replaced by an expression of such cold hunger that I nearly stumbled backward. "David is indisposed at the moment, but he's eager to see you. We both are." The temperature around us seemed to drop 20 degrees. Frost began forming on the nearby ferns despite the mild October air, and our breath came out in visible puffs. Jake stood motionless in the center of this expanding circle of cold, watching us with eyes that now definitely reflected a light that wasn't there. "You're not Jake," Sarah whispered. "I am Jake," it replied, voice echoing strangely among the trees. "I am everything Jake ever was, and so much more. I am his memories, his dreams, his secret shames. I know about the girl he left crying at senior prom. I know about the scholarship money he stole from his roommate. I know about the night he drove home drunk and never told anyone about the cat." The thing wearing Jake's face smiled again, and this time I could see too many teeth, sharp and yellowed like old bone. David knows these things too now. He understands what he really is, what you all are. "What are you?" I managed to ask. "Hungry," it said simply. "So very, very hungry." The cold was spreading, turning the moss brittle and black beneath our feet. Ice crystals formed on the trees, creating fractal patterns that hurt to look at directly. And somewhere in the distance I could hear David calling our names, but his voice was wrong too. Too high, too eager, carrying harmonics that made my teeth ache. "Michael! Sarah! Come see what I found. It's wonderful." Sarah grabbed my hand, her fingers ice cold despite her gloves. "We have to run." But the thing that had been Jake was already moving, gliding toward us with that unnatural silence. And behind it, David emerged from the forest, his movements equally wrong, equally graceful. His face wore the same terrible smile, the same hunger. "Don't run," David called, his voice a sing-song parody of his usual tone. "There's nowhere to go. The forest goes on forever." We checked. We ran anyway. The forest became a nightmare maze of reaching branches and moss-slicked obstacles. Behind us, I could hear them following. Not running, just walking with that same patient glide, calling our names in voices that grew less human with each repetition. They didn't need to hurry. They knew something we didn't. "The trail!" Sarah gasped, pointing to a gap in the trees ahead. "There!" But when we reached it, the trail led upward again, deeper into the mountains where the trees grew so close together we had to turn sideways to pass between them. The air grew thinner, harder to breathe, and the light that filtered through the canopy had taken on a sickly green tinge. "This way." Sarah pulled me toward what looked like a downward slope, but after 50 yards it leveled out and began climbing again. Every path led up. Every trail wound deeper into the forest. It was as if the mountain itself had rearranged to trap us. We stopped to rest beside a moss-covered boulder, our breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind us, the voices of our former friends echoed among the trees, always getting closer, never quite catching up. "What are they?" Sarah whispered. I thought about the old stories, the legends that had emerged from these ancient mountains long before Europeans ever set foot in the New World. Stories of creatures that lived in the deep forests, things that were always hungry, always waiting for travelers who strayed too far from the safety of fire and iron. "Wendigo," I said. "Has to be. Something that takes people, wears their faces." "That's just folklore," she protested, but her voice lacked conviction. "Is it? Look around, Sarah. Look at where we are." The forest had grown stranger still. The trees were massive now, their trunks easily 20 feet in diameter, their bark carved with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed peripherally. The ground beneath our feet was soft, spongy, more like flesh than earth. And the smell. God, the smell. Sweet corruption, like flowers left too long in standing water. "Michael," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper, "look at your hands." I looked down and felt my heart stop. My hands were pale, the veins showing dark beneath translucent skin. When I flexed my fingers, they moved too easily, as if the bones had gone soft. And when I touched my face, the skin felt cold, numb, like touching someone else's flesh. "It's happening to us, too," I realized. "Whatever got them, it's changing us." Sarah held up her own hands, watching in horror as the fingernails began to elongate, growing sharp and yellowed. "How long do we have?" "I don't know." The voices were getting closer now, singing our names in harmony that made the air itself vibrate. Through the trees, I caught glimpses of movement, pale figures that might once have been human, gliding between the massive trunks with predatory grace. "There," Sarah pointed to what looked like a natural shelter formed by a fallen tree. "Maybe we can hide." But as we crawled into the hollow space beneath the massive trunk, I realized our mistake. The fallen tree wasn't fallen at all. It was growing horizontally, its branches forming a cage around us, and carved into its bark, fresh and bleeding sap, were symbols that hurt to look at. We were trapped. The singing stopped. In the sudden silence, I could hear them approaching. Footsteps that made no sound, but somehow I knew they were there, drawing closer, patient, inevitable. "Sarah," I whispered. "I know," she breathed back. Jake appeared first, crawling into our shelter with that terrible smile. His skin had gone completely white, almost translucent, and his eyes were solid black. When he opened his mouth, I could see rows of needle teeth extending all the way back to his throat. "Found you," he sang in a voice like breaking glass. David was right behind him, his transformation even more advanced. His limbs had grown long and thin, joints bending in directions human anatomy didn't allow. When he moved, I could hear his bones creaking like old wood. "Time to join us," David whispered. "Time to understand what hunger really means." They reached for us with fingers that had grown too long, ended in claws sharp enough to part flesh like water, and I felt the change accelerating in my own body, bones softening, muscles stretching, mind filling with alien thoughts of endless appetite. But somewhere in the growing darkness of my changing consciousness, I remembered something David had said during our planning sessions. He'd researched the area obsessively, reading every piece of folklore and local legend he could find. And he'd mentioned something about the old Cherokee beliefs, about certain trees that were sacred, certain symbols that could ward off the spirits that lived in the deep places. Iron. The old legends always mentioned iron. With fingers that were already beginning to stretch and change, I fumbled for my knife, a simple camping blade with a steel handle that my grandfather had given me. The metal felt warm against my palm, almost alive. Jake hissed and drew back when he saw it, his black eyes reflecting the dim light like a nocturnal predator's. "Iron burns," he said, and his voice carried a note of genuine fear. I slashed wildly with the blade, not trying to kill but just to drive them back. Where the steel touched Jake's pale skin, it left smoking wounds that seeped black fluid instead of blood. He shrieked, a sound no human throat could make, and scrambled backward. "Sarah, your knife!" She understood immediately, drawing her own blade. The steel seemed to glow with its own light in the supernatural gloom, and when she brandished it at David, he recoiled with a sound like tearing metal. "Iron and fire," Sarah gasped, understanding. "The old protections." We had no fire, but we had steel, and steel was enough to carve a path through the nightmare our friends had become. They followed us as we fought our way out of the hollow tree, but they kept their distance now, circling like wolves but unable to approach the glowing steel in our hands. The forest began to change around us as we moved, reality reasserting itself in the presence of cold iron. The massive trees shrank back to normal proportions. The carved symbols faded from their bark. The spongy, flesh-like ground became ordinary forest loam again, and somewhere ahead, I could see real sunlight filtering through normal trees. "This way," I shouted, pushing through a final barrier of undergrowth. We emerged onto a hiking trail. Not the one we'd started on, but a real trail with proper blazes and a wooden sign indicating distances to various landmarks. Behind us, our former friends had stopped at the edge of the normal forest, unable or unwilling to leave their domain of twisted trees and hungry shadows. Jake raised one pale hand in what might have been a wave goodbye. "See you next time," he called, and his voice carried the promise of patient eternity. "We'll be waiting." The sun was setting as we reached the parking area where our car waited, exactly where we'd left it 24 hours earlier. But according to our phones, now miraculously working again, we'd been missing for 4 days. The official story was that we'd gotten lost, that Jake and David had continued hiking while Sarah and I returned to get help. Search and rescue found no trace of them despite weeks of searching. They were declared missing, presumed dead after falling into one of the area's many deep ravines. I know better. Sometimes on quiet nights when the wind is still, I can hear them calling from the mountains. They're still up there, still waiting, still hungry. And sometimes I feel the urge to return, to finish what was started in that place where time moves strangely and the trees remember older laws. But I keep a piece of iron in my pocket now, a reminder of what I learned in the green darkness of the savage River State Forest. Some hungers are older than civilization, patient as stone, and they're always waiting for the next group of travelers who stray too far from the light. Sarah moved to California after graduation. We don't talk about what happened, but sometimes she sends me pictures of iron jewelry, subtle reminders that some people remember the old protections. I've heard she won't go camping anymore, won't even sleep without a steel knife under her pillow. I understand, because even now, writing this years later in the safety of my apartment, I can feel them out there, watching, waiting, growing hungrier with each passing season. And I know that someday, despite all my precautions, I'll find myself on a trail that leads upward into mountains where the trees grow too close together and the moss covers everything in green silence, where phone signals die and GPS coordinates lie and time moves like cold honey. They're very patient after all, and they know I'll come back eventually. Everyone always comes back. The hunger sees to that. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 34 years old. This happened in Green Ridge State Forest, deep in the mountains of western Maryland, during what was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip with my co-workers. I should have known something was wrong when the GPS started glitching 20 miles outside of Cumberland. The blue dot that represented our location kept jumping erratically across the screen, placing us sometimes in Pennsylvania, sometimes in West Virginia, never quite where we actually were. Jake Morrison, riding shotgun in my Jeep, laughed it off as we wound through the increasingly narrow mountain roads. "Technology, man," he said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "Give me a paper map any day." Behind us, Sarah Chen and Tom Bradley followed in Tom's pickup truck, probably arguing about music choices. Sarah had insisted on bringing her vintage camping gear, canvas tents, cast-iron cookware, the works. She was our office's resident outdoors enthusiast, the one who'd organized this trip to build team morale after the Henderson account had nearly driven us all to nervous breakdowns. The fourth member of our group, Lisa Rodriguez, had backed out at the last minute. "Family emergency," she'd said. Looking back, I envy her that emergency. Green Ridge State Forest sprawled across the Allegheny Mountains like a green scar, 44,000 acres of dense woodland crisscrossed by old logging roads and forgotten trails. We'd chosen a backcountry camping area called Twig Hollow, accessible only by a winding dirt road that seemed to grow narrower with each mile. The trees pressed closer as we climbed, their branches forming a canopy so thick that even at 3 in the afternoon, we were driving through premature twilight. "You sure this is the right way?" Jake asked, studying the paper map spread across his lap. His confidence in analog navigation was already wavering. "According to this, yeah." I squinted at the road ahead. Should be another 2 miles. That's when we found the car. It sat at an odd angle on the narrow road, a rusted Honda Civic that looked like it had been there for months. Weeds grew up through the wheel wells, and the windshield was spiderwebbed with cracks. But what made my stomach clench was the fact that it was blocking our path completely, positioned as if someone had deliberately parked it to prevent access to the road beyond. I stopped the Jeep and heard Tom's truck rumble to a halt behind us. Jake and I got out to investigate while the others joined us, Sarah shouldering her massive hiking pack with practiced ease. "Well, this is weird," Tom said, running a hand through his thinning brown hair. At 42, he was the oldest of our group, a quiet accountant who rarely spoke up in meetings but had surprised us all by agreeing to come camping. "Think we can push it off the road?" The car's doors were unlocked. Inside, I found a Maryland registration expired 3 years ago, some moldy fast food containers, and a cell phone so old it had actual buttons. The battery was long dead. No signs of violence, no blood, nothing that screamed danger, just an abandoned car in the middle of nowhere. "There's enough room to squeeze around it on the left," Sarah observed, studying the gap between the Honda and the tree line. "If we're careful." We managed to maneuver both vehicles past the obstruction, but the incident left us all slightly unsettled. The forest felt different now, more watchful. Every shadow between the trees seemed to hide something just out of sight. Twig Hollow turned out to be a small clearing beside a creek that gurgled over moss-covered stones. It was beautiful in the way that only untouched wilderness can be, but there was something else there too. Something that made the hair on my arms stand up even before we'd finished unloading our gear. "Anyone else feel like we're being watched?" Jake asked, echoing my own thoughts as he surveyed the tree line. "It's just the forest," Sarah said, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. "Animals. They're curious about us." We set up camp in the fading daylight, working with an efficiency born of nervous energy. Sarah's canvas tent went up first, a sturdy 2-person affair that could probably survive a hurricane. Jake and I shared a modern dome tent, while Tom had brought a one-man pup tent that looked like it belonged in a Civil War reenactment. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped 20 degrees. The cold came down from the mountains like a living thing, seeping through our clothes and settling into our bones. Our campfire, which had burned bright and cheerful during dinner, began to sputter despite the dry wood we'd gathered. "Fire's acting weird," Tom observed, poking at the logs with a stick. The flames guttered and danced, sometimes burning blue-green instead of orange. "Might be something in the wood." "Copper deposits," Sarah suggested, but she sounded uncertain. "Sometimes minerals in dead trees can change the color." None of us mentioned that the wood had been burning normally just an hour before. We told ghost stories, as campers have done since the beginning of time. Jake, emboldened by the bottle of bourbon we'd been passing around, shared local legends he'd researched online. Stories of the Appalachian Mountains, of things that wandered the deep woods in search of prey. "The Algonquian tribes around here had a name for it," he said, his voice dropping to a dramatic whisper. "Wendigo. A cannibalistic creature born from human greed and hunger. They say it's always starving, always hunting, and it can mimic human voices to lure people into the forest." "That's just folklore," Sarah scoffed, but she moved closer to the fire. "Is it?" Jake asked. "There's been documented cases of people going missing in these mountains. Hikers, hunters, entire families. They find their camps intact, their belongings untouched, but the people just vanish." Tom was quiet, staring into the flames with an expression I couldn't read. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible over the crackling fire. "My grandfather used to hunt these mountains," he said, "back in the 50s and 60s. He told me once that there were places up here where the trees grew wrong, where you could feel something watching you from the shadows. Said the old-timers knew to stay away from Twig Hollow after dark." "Why didn't you mention this before?" Sarah demanded. Tom shrugged. "Didn't seem important. Just old man stories, you know. Superstition." But I could see the doubt in his eyes, the same doubt that was growing in all of us. The forest around our camp had fallen unnaturally silent. No owl calls, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Even the creek seemed to muffle its voice to a barely audible whisper. That's when we heard the first scream. It came from deep in the woods, echoing off the mountains in a way that made it impossible to determine direction or distance. High-pitched and agonized, it sounded almost human, but wrong somehow, as if vocal cords were being used in ways they weren't designed for. We all froze, the bourbon forgotten. The scream lasted perhaps 10 seconds, then cut off abruptly, leaving us in silence that felt heavy and oppressive. "What the hell was that?" Jake whispered. "Could be a mountain lion," Sarah said, but her voice shook. "They can sound almost human when they scream." "That wasn't a mountain lion," Tom said flatly. Another scream answered the first, this one from a different direction. Then another and another, until we were surrounded by a chorus of inhuman wailing that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The sounds echoed off the mountains, distorting and multiplying until it became impossible to tell how many voices there actually were. "We should leave," I said, standing up so quickly that I knocked over my camp chair. "Pack up now, drive out tonight." "In the dark?" Sarah shook her head. "On those mountain roads, we'll end up wrapped around a tree." She was right, but staying felt like suicide. The screaming had stopped, but the silence that followed was somehow worse. It felt expectant, as if something was waiting for us to make the first move. "We'll take watches," Tom suggested. 2-hour shifts. Keep the fire going." It was a reasonable plan, but I could see the fear in everyone's eyes. Whatever was out there in the darkness knew we were here, and it was patient. Jake volunteered for the first watch. The rest of us retreated to our tents, but sleep was impossible. I lay in my sleeping bag, fully clothed and listening to every sound from outside. The rustle of fabric as Jake shifted position, the occasional crack of wood being added to the fire, and underneath it all, a sense of presence that made my skin crawl. Sometime around midnight, I heard footsteps circling our camp. Slow, deliberate steps that seemed too heavy to belong to any forest animal. They moved in a perfect circle around the perimeter, just outside the reach of our firelight. I wanted to call out to Jake, to warn him, but my throat had constricted to the point where I could barely breathe. The footsteps stopped directly outside my tent. Through the thin nylon wall, I could hear breathing. Deep, ragged inhalations that seemed to go on forever, followed by wet, rattling exhalations. Whatever was out there was smelling us, tasting our scent on the night air. Then it spoke. "Michael," it whispered in a voice that sounded almost like Sarah's but stretched and distorted, like a recording played at the wrong speed. "Michael, come outside. We need to talk." I bit down on my knuckles to keep from screaming. The thing outside my tent knew my name, and it was using Sarah's voice to call me. But Sarah was in her tent 20 feet away. I could hear her breathing, fast and shallow with fear. "Michael," the voice called again, more insistent this time. "Don't be afraid. It's just me." Footsteps moved away from my tent toward Jake's position by the fire. I heard a brief, muffled conversation, Jake's voice asking, "Sarah, what are you doing up?" and that wrong voice responding with words I couldn't make out. Then Jake screamed. It was a sound of pure terror that cut through the night like a blade. I heard him thrashing around, heard the fire being scattered as he fell into it, heard something wet and final that ended his screaming abruptly. "Jake!" Sarah's voice came from her tent, high and panicked. "Jake, what's happening?" I forced myself to unzip my tent and look outside. The fire had been reduced to scattered embers that cast everything in hellish red light. Jake was nowhere to be seen, but dark stains on the ground near the fire pit told their own story. "Where's Jake?" Tom emerged from his tent, his face pale in the dying firelight. "Something took him," I said, my voice barely recognizable as my own. Something that sounded like Sarah. Sarah crawled out of her tent, her usually perfect hair disheveled, her eyes wide with terror. "That wasn't me," she said. "I was in my tent the whole time. You heard me in my tent." We huddled together by the remains of the fire, backs to each other, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. Tom tried to rebuild the fire while Sarah and I gathered more wood, none of us wanting to venture more than a few feet from the others. "We have to get out of here," I said. "Now, in the dark. I don't care about the road." "The keys," Tom said suddenly, his face going ashen. "Jake had the keys to your Jeep. He was holding them when—" My heart sank. The keys to my vehicle were somewhere out there in the darkness, probably with whatever was left of Jake Morrison. Tom's truck keys were in his tent, but one vehicle wasn't enough for all of us, and the thought of leaving someone behind was unbearable. "We'll take the truck," Sarah decided. "Squeeze into the cab together, deal with the logistics later." But when Tom went to retrieve his keys, he found his tent empty except for his sleeping bag. The keys were gone. "They were right here," he said, his voice rising toward hysteria. "I put them in the mesh pocket right here. They're gone." We searched frantically through his gear, but the keys had vanished as completely as Jake had. We were stranded in Twig Hollow with something that knew our names and could mimic our voices. "The car," I said suddenly. "The abandoned Honda. If we can get it started—" "It's been sitting there for years," Sarah protested. "The battery's probably dead. The engine's probably seized. We have to try. It's better than waiting here for that thing to pick us off one by one." But the Honda was 2 miles away, down a dark mountain road that would be crawling with whatever had taken Jake. The thought of making that journey on foot in the darkness made me physically sick. "There's another option," Tom said quietly. "We could try to make it to the ranger station. There's supposed to be one about 5 miles east of here. 5 miles through mountain wilderness in the dark, with something hunting us. It wasn't much better than the car option, but at least we'd be moving toward help instead of toward a vehicle that probably wouldn't start. We packed light, water, a flashlight each, and Tom's .38 revolver that none of us had known he was carrying until he pulled it from his gear. The gun was small comfort against something that could mimic human voices and move through the forest without making a sound, but it was better than nothing. The forest at night was a maze of shadows and whispered threats. Our flashlights created pools of pale light that seemed pitifully small against the pressing darkness. Every tree could hide a predator. Every shadow could conceal something waiting to pounce. We'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes when Sarah stopped abruptly. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. We all listened. Somewhere ahead of us, barely audible over the sound of our own breathing, came the sound of someone calling for help. A weak, pained voice that sounded remarkably like Jake. "Help me," the voice called. "Please, I'm hurt. I can't see you. Where are you?" Tom raised his revolver, his hands shaking. "That's not Jake," he said. "Help me," the voice called again, closer now. "Sarah, Michael, Tom, please don't leave me here." The voice was coming from our left, deeper in the woods, but there was something wrong with it, something that made my teeth ache. It was Jake's voice, but the cadence was off, the intonation slightly too high, as if something was struggling to remember how human speech worked. "Jake's dead," Sarah said firmly. "We all know Jake's dead." "How can you be sure?" the voice asked, and now it was coming from our right, as if whatever was speaking had moved 50 yards in complete silence. "How can you be sure of anything in the dark?" We pressed closer together, our flashlight beams sweeping frantically through the trees. The voice seemed to come from everywhere now. Sometimes Jake's familiar tone, sometimes Sarah's, sometimes Tom's. It was taunting us, playing with us like a cat with wounded mice. "The ranger station," I whispered. "We keep moving toward the ranger station." But navigation in the dark was proving nearly impossible. The trail we'd been following had branched several times, and each fork looked identical in our flashlight beams. Worse, I was beginning to suspect that the paths were changing when we weren't looking, that we were being herded deeper into the forest rather than toward civilization. That's when Tom disappeared. One moment he was right behind us, his breathing ragged but steady. The next moment, I turned around and he was gone. No sound of struggle, no scream, just empty darkness where he'd been walking 2 seconds before. "Tom!" Sarah called out, forgetting caution in her panic. "I'm here," came his voice from somewhere ahead of us. "This way, I found the trail." But Sarah and I looked at each other with growing horror. Tom's voice was coming from in front of us, but we could both clearly remember him being behind us when he vanished. "That's not Tom," I said. "This way," the voice called again, patient and encouraging. "Just a little further. The ranger station is just ahead." We turned and ran. Branches whipped at our faces and roots caught at our feet as we crashed through the underbrush. Behind us, something large was moving through the forest, keeping pace with us easily despite our panic-fueled speed. I could hear it breathing, hear the crack of branches under its weight, but every time I looked back, my flashlight showed only empty forest. Sarah stumbled and fell, her light flying from her hand to spin crazily across the ground. I helped her up, but when I turned around, there was a figure standing 20 feet away. It looked like Tom, but something was fundamentally wrong with its proportions. Too tall, too thin, with arms that hung down past its knees. In the wavering beam of my flashlight, its face seemed to shift and blur. Sometimes Tom's familiar features, sometimes something else entirely. "Found you," it said in Tom's voice, but the smile that spread across its face was far too wide, revealing teeth that gleamed like broken glass. I pulled Tom's revolver from my jacket and fired 3 times. The shots were deafeningly loud in the forest silence, and I saw at least one bullet strike the thing center mass. But instead of falling, it laughed, a sound like wind through dead leaves. "Iron and fire," it said, still smiling that terrible smile. "Just like the old stories said. But you don't have enough bullets, Michael Williams, and you don't have enough time." Sarah grabbed my arm. "Run," she whispered. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs threatened to give out, crashing through the forest like 2 animals fleeing a wildfire. The thing behind us made no effort to be quiet now. It crashed through the trees like a freight train, howling with a voice that seemed to come from multiple throats at once. When we finally stopped to catch our breath, we found ourselves in another clearing, this one marked by a circle of standing stones that were clearly much older than any human settlement in the area. Ancient symbols were carved into the rock faces, worn almost smooth by centuries of weather but still visible in our flashlight beams. "What is this place?" Sarah gasped. I didn't know, but something about the stone circle felt significant. The thing pursuing us had gone silent the moment we'd entered the clearing, as if there were rules it had to follow, boundaries it couldn't cross. Native American, I guessed, some kind of ceremonial site. The stones were arranged in a perfect circle about 30 feet across with what looked like an altar or fire pit in the center. Sarah played her flashlight beam across the symbols carved into the nearest stone. Her face troubled. "These aren't Native American," she said slowly. "I've seen symbols like this before. They're Celtic, or something like Celtic." That was impossible, of course. The Celts had never made it to the Appalachian Mountains, at least not until European settlers arrived in the 18th century. But the symbols did look European. Spirals and knots and creatures that seemed to writhe in the shifting light. "Early settlers," I said, trying to convince myself as much as her. "Irish immigrants, maybe. Built this place to remind them of home?" But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. The stones were too old, too weathered. They'd been standing in this forest for much longer than a few hundred years. "Look at this," Sarah said, directing her light toward the altar in the center of the circle. The stone surface was stained dark with something that could have been blood, though it was impossible to tell how old the stains were, but more disturbing were the bones scattered around the altar's base. Not human bones, thank God, but the remains of deer and smaller animals. Some looked fresh, the meat still clinging to the ribs in places. "Offerings," I said. "Something's been bringing food here." That's when we heard the voice from the edge of the clearing. "You can't stay in there forever," it said, using Jake's voice again. "The circle won't protect you when the sun comes up. And I can wait. I've been waiting for a very long time." I looked at my watch. It was nearly 4 in the morning. Dawn was still hours away, but our pursuer was right. We couldn't stay in the stone circle indefinitely. Sooner or later, we'd have to leave, and it would be waiting. "What do you want?" Sarah called out, her voice stronger than I felt. "What I've always wanted," came the reply, though the voice had changed to Tom's now. "To feed, to satisfy the hunger. You smell so good, Sarah Chen, warm and alive and terrified. Fear makes the meat tender." "You're sick," she said. "You're a sick human being who needs help." Laughter echoed from the tree line, but it didn't sound human anymore. It was the sound of wind through caves, of ice cracking under pressure, of things that should be dead trying to draw breath. "Human?" the voice asked, amused. "I haven't been human for a very long time, not since the winter of 1847, when the snows came early and the hunting was poor, when my family started to look like food and I couldn't remember why that was wrong." Sarah and I exchanged glances. 1847 was more than a century and a half ago. Whatever was talking to us claimed to be older than anyone could possibly be. "The early settlers," it continued, its voice shifting and changing like smoke. "They brought such wonderful stories from the old country, tales of hunger and desperation, of people who ate human flesh and became something more than human, something better." I fired another shot into the darkness, though I couldn't see what I was aiming at. The bullet disappeared into the trees without apparent effect. "3 bullets left," the voice observed. "Better make them count. Michael Williams." The sky began to lighten almost imperceptibly in the east. Dawn was still hours away, but I could feel the night beginning its slow retreat. Our stalker was right, though. Daylight wouldn't necessarily save us. If it was some kind of deranged human, it could hunt just as effectively in daylight. And if it was something else... "Tell me about the stones," I called out. "What is this place?" "Older than memory," the voice replied, coming from a different direction now. "The people who built this place knew about creatures like me. They knew how to bargain with the hunger, how to appease it. Regular offerings, fresh meat, and the circle would protect them." "Protect them from what?" "From me, of course. From the thing that wanders the deep places, always hunting, always hungry. But the people are gone now, and the offerings stopped long ago. I've been so very hungry, Michael Williams. So very lonely." Sarah grabbed my arm. "The bones," she whispered. "The fresh bones around the altar. Someone's still making offerings." I looked at the scattered remains with new understanding. Deer bones, rabbit bones, maybe raccoon. Someone had been feeding this thing, keeping it satisfied with animal meat. But apparently that wasn't enough anymore. "Who's been feeding you?" I called out. "A kind old man," the voice said, sounding almost wistful now. "He understood the old ways, the old bargains, but he died last winter and I've been so hungry ever since. Do you know what it's like to be hungry for more than a century? To feel your belly eating itself from the inside?" Tom, I realized with a chill. Tom's grandfather, who had hunted these mountains for decades, who had told stories about places where the trees grew wrong and something watched from the shadows. He'd known about this thing, had been keeping it fed to protect other hunters and hikers. "But animal meat only goes so far," the voice continued. "It takes the edge off, but it doesn't truly satisfy. Not like human flesh, not like the meat of something that can feel fear and despair and the sweet knowledge of its own mortality." The sky was definitely getting lighter now, though it would be another hour before true dawn. I could make out individual trees at the edge of the clearing, could see that nothing was moving between them. But that didn't mean we were safe. "Why don't you just leave?" Sarah asked. "Go somewhere else. There are bigger cities, more people." "Cities are too bright, too noisy," the voice said. "Too many eyes, too many questions. The forest is my place, has always been my place, and people come to me here. Hikers, hunters, campers like yourselves. They walk into my domain of their own free will, and then they become mine." "We're not yours," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. "Aren't you? You came here despite all the warnings. The abandoned car that should have turned you back, the stories your friend told by the fire, the screams in the night. At every turn you could have left, but you chose to stay. You chose to enter my domain." There was truth in those words that chilled me more than the mountain air. We had ignored every warning sign, dismissed every red flag. Part of me wondered if we'd been influenced somehow, drawn here by something more than coincidence. "The GPS," Sarah said suddenly. "The GPS malfunctioning. It led us here." "I'm very good with electronic devices," the voice said, almost prideful. "So easy to nudge a signal, to make a blue dot dance across a screen. Technology makes hunting so much easier than it used to be." The light was getting stronger now, and I could see movement at the edge of the clearing. Something tall and pale was pacing back and forth between the trees, never quite stepping into the circle but never moving far away either. "Dawn's coming," I called out. "Your power's going to weaken." "Will it?" the voice asked, amused. "Who told you that? The same stories that said garlic repels vampires and silver bullets kill werewolves?" "Daylight doesn't weaken me, Michael Williams. It just makes me easier to see." As if to prove its point, the thing stepped partially into the clearing. In the growing light, I could see that it wore Tom's face but stretched over a frame that was definitely not human. Too tall, too thin, with joints that bent in directions joints shouldn't bend. Its skin was pale and mottled, like something that had been underground for a long time. "Hello, friends," it said in Tom's voice, though Tom's face didn't quite match the words being spoken. Sarah raised her flashlight and screamed. In the bright beam, the thing's true face was revealed. Tom's features were there, but they were wrong, stretched over skull structure that was fundamentally inhuman. The eyes were too large and completely black, the mouth too wide and filled with teeth that belonged in the jaws of a shark. I emptied the remaining bullets into its chest. Each shot struck home, punching holes in its pale flesh, but it just stood there smiling that horrible smile. Black blood oozed from the wounds, but they didn't seem to slow it down at all. "Iron and fire," it said again. "The old ways. But you're missing something, aren't you? The knowledge that made the bargains work, the understanding that some hungers can only be satisfied, never eliminated." It took a step into the circle, then another. Whatever protection the stones had offered was apparently conditional, and we no longer met the conditions. "Run," I told Sarah. "Where?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Where can we run?" The thing in Tom's stolen face looked at her with those terrible black eyes. "Nowhere," it said gently. "This is where the running ends." But Sarah surprised us both. Instead of running, she walked calmly to the altar in the center of the circle and picked up one of the bones scattered around its base. A deer femur, thick and heavy. Then she walked back to where I stood and handed it to me. "The bones," she said quietly. "They're not just offerings. They're weapons." I looked at the bone in my hands. It was old and bleached white, but there was something else. Symbols carved into its surface, the same Celtic spirals and knots that decorated the standing stones. "Blessed weapons," Sarah continued, "sanctified by whatever rituals took place here. If bullets won't work—" I swung the bone like a club, catching the creature across its malformed jaw. The effect was immediate and dramatic. It shrieked and stumbled backward, its stolen face contorting with pain and rage. "The old ways," it hissed. "You know some of the old ways." I hit it again, harder this time, and heard something crack. The thing that wore Tom's face fell to its knees, black blood streaming from its mouth. "But not all of them," it said, and suddenly it was laughing again. "You know how to hurt me, but you don't know how to bind me. And there are others. There are always others." More shapes began emerging from the forest around the clearing. Pale, emaciated figures that moved with that same inhuman grace. Some wore faces I recognized. Jake, Tom, even people I'd never seen before. Men and women in hiking clothes, hunters in camouflage, a family in matching National Park Service t-shirts. "Everyone who comes to my forest," the first creature said, its voice now a chorus of stolen voices. "Everyone who enters Twig Hollow after dark, they become part of the hunt, part of the hunger." There were at least a dozen of them now, shambling figures that had once been human but were now something else entirely. They moved with purpose, surrounding the stone circle, cutting off any possibility of escape. "The offerings," I said, understanding flooding through me. "Tom's grandfather wasn't just feeding you, he was keeping you from creating more of yourself." "Very good," the thing said, clapping its hands in mock applause. "Feed the hunger with animal meat, and the need for human prey decreases. But take away the offerings, let the hunger grow too strong, and I'm forced to hunt, and every kill creates another hunter." Sarah had found another bone weapon, a carved antler that gleamed with the same spiral symbols. She held it like a spear, backing toward the altar in the center of the circle. "How do we stop you?" she demanded. "You don't," the creature said simply. "You become part of us, or you die and become part of us anyway. Those are the only options now." But I was looking at the altar, at the dark stains that covered its surface. Not just blood, I realized, but something else. The stone itself was different from the standing stones around the circle. Darker, more porous, as if it had absorbed more than just blood over the centuries. "The altar," I said to Sarah, "it's not just for offerings. It's a binding stone." The creatures around the clearing hissed and began moving forward. Whatever I was thinking, they didn't want me to pursue it. "The symbols," Sarah said, understanding. "They're not just decorative. They're part of a binding spell." The carved spirals and knots covered every inch of the altar's surface, forming an intricate pattern that seemed to pulse and shift in the growing daylight. But some of the symbols had been damaged, worn away by time and weather until the pattern was incomplete. "If we could complete the binding," I said, but the creatures were already inside the circle now, moving toward us with predatory intent. Sarah thrust her antler spear into the chest of the nearest one, a thing that wore Jake's face but moved like a broken marionette. It screamed and fell backward, but others were closing in fast. I swung my bone club at anything that came within reach, the carved symbols along its length seeming to glow with their own inner light. The weapons could hurt them, could even destroy them. But there were too many. For every one we struck down, two more seemed to take its place. "The blood," Sarah gasped, dodging claws that would have opened her throat. "The binding needs blood to complete it." Of course, every binding ritual in every folklore tradition required some kind of sacrifice, some offering of life force to power the magic. The altar was stained with the blood of countless offerings, but apparently it needed something more. Not just any blood, I realized. Willing blood, a conscious sacrifice. The thing that wore Tom's face laughed, understanding what I was thinking. You would die to bind us? Trap us in this circle forever? If it means stopping you, I said, though my voice shook with terror. If it means no one else has to die. Michael, no, Sarah said, but she was fighting off 3 of the creatures at once, her antler spear flashing in the morning light. I looked at the incomplete symbols on the altar's surface. With my finger dipped in my own blood, I might be able to trace the missing patterns, complete the binding that had held these things in check for centuries. But it would require more blood than I could lose and still survive. The thing in Tom's stolen form seemed to read my thoughts. A noble gesture, it said. But it won't work. The binding was never meant to destroy us, only to contain us. And containers can be broken. Maybe, I said, backing toward the altar, but it held you for a century and a half. That's long enough for people to forget you exist, to stop coming to places like Twig Hollow. You're forgetting something, the creature said, its smile widening to inhuman proportions. The binding required a bloodline to maintain it. Tom's grandfather kept the old bargain alive. With him dead, and you about to join us, who will feed the altar? Who will maintain the binding? I felt the stone altar against my back and knew I was out of room to retreat. Around the circle, Sarah was still fighting, but she was tiring. Blood ran down her arms from claw marks and her movements were becoming sluggish. That's when I remembered the gun. Not Tom's revolver, which was empty and useless, but Sarah's emergency flare gun that she'd brought with her camping gear. It was designed to signal for help, but flares burned at nearly 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to cauterize wounds, hot enough to sear symbols into stone. "Sarah," I called out. "The flare gun. Where's the flare gun?" "My pack," she gasped, stabbing another creature through what should have been its heart. "By the stones." I could see her backpack where she'd dropped it when we first entered the circle, but it was on the other side of the altar, and there were at least 6 creatures between me and it. The thing wearing Tom's face was enjoying our desperation. "Even if you reach it," it said, "even if you complete the binding, you'll both be trapped in here with us. Forever. Is that really better than simply joining us?" Maybe not, but at least we'd die human. I feinted left, then dove right, rolling past the outstretched claws of 2 creatures and coming up next to Sarah's pack. The flare gun was buried under camping gear, but I found it just as something with Jake's face grabbed my ankle. The flare ignited with a brilliant red light that seemed to drive the creatures back. They hissed and covered their stolen eyes, their pale skin smoking in the intense illumination. I sprinted back to the altar, dodging between the temporarily blinded monsters. The flare would burn for only 15 minutes, but 15 minutes might be enough. I pressed the burning end against the altar's surface and began tracing the missing symbols, following the pattern carved into the stone centuries ago. The flare scorched the rock, leaving glowing lines that seemed to pulse with their own energy. "Stop!" the thing in Tom's form commanded, but it couldn't approach the altar while the flare burned. "You don't know what you're doing. The binding isn't just a prison, it's a doorway. Complete it wrong, and you'll open a path to things much worse than us." I ignored its warnings and continued tracing symbols, my hand guided by some instinct I didn't understand. The pattern seemed to complete itself, the carved spirals and knots forming a web of power that spread outward from the altar to encompass the entire circle. The creatures began to scream, a sound like wind through broken glass. One by one, they started to dissolve, their stolen faces melting away to reveal the hollow-eyed skulls beneath. But they didn't disappear entirely. Instead, they were pulled into the standing stones themselves, becoming part of the carved symbols, their essence bound into the ancient rock. "You've doomed us all," the thing that had been Tom said as its form began to fade. "The binding won't hold forever, and when it breaks, we'll remember what you've done here. The last thing I saw was its terrible smile before it, too, was pulled into the stones, leaving Sarah and me alone in the circle as the flare finally burned out. The forest around us was completely silent. No bird calls, no rustling of leaves, nothing to indicate that anything lived in these woods. Even the stream had stopped its gurgling as if the water itself was afraid to make noise. "Is it over?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. I looked at the standing stones, at the symbols that now seemed to shift and move in my peripheral vision. The creatures were bound, yes, but not destroyed. They were part of the circle now, part of the ancient pattern that kept them contained. "For now," I said. We made our way out of the forest as the sun finally rose above the mountains. The abandoned Honda was still blocking the road, but we managed to push it aside and found that Tom's truck keys had mysteriously reappeared in his tent. Someone, or something, wanted us to leave. We drove in silence until we reached the first gas station, where Sarah called the police to report Jake and Tom missing. We told them about a hiking accident, about our friends falling into a ravine during a night hike. The search and rescue teams would find no trace of them, of course, but that was better than trying to explain the truth. I never went camping again. Neither did Sarah, though we stayed in touch for a while afterward. She moved to California within a year, as far from the Appalachian Mountains as she could get. I don't blame her. Sometimes late at night I think about that stone circle in Twig Hollow, about the binding that requires regular maintenance, regular offerings to keep it strong. Tom's grandfather had understood the responsibility that came with knowledge of such places. He'd kept the old bargain alive for decades, feeding animal meat to things that preferred human flesh. But he was dead now, and the binding was only as strong as the person maintaining it. Last month I started buying fresh venison from a local hunter. Good cuts, the kind that would satisfy even an inhuman hunger. I drive up to Green Ridge State Forest every few weeks, always during daylight, never staying after dark. I leave the meat at the edge of Twig Hollow and get back in my truck before the sun begins to set. It's not much, but it's something. A small offering to keep a larger horror contained. Because I know that the binding won't last forever, and when it finally fails, the things trapped in those stones will remember what Sarah and I did to them. They'll be hungry when they get out, and they'll know exactly where to find us. My name is David Jones, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the remote depths of Savage River State Forest, Maryland, during what was supposed to be a simple 3-day camping trip with my German Shepherd, Max. I'd been planning this trip for months, needing to escape the suffocating routine of my accounting job in Baltimore. The Savage River area promised isolation, thick forests, winding trails, and miles between you and the nearest cell tower. Perfect for someone who wanted to disappear from the world for a while. Max, my 5-year-old shepherd, had been restless in our cramped apartment, and I figured the wilderness would do us both good. The drive took 4 hours through increasingly narrow roads until I reached the trailhead near Backbone Mountain. October in western Maryland painted the forest in dying colors, rust-red maples and golden oaks that seemed to bleed in the afternoon light. The temperature had dropped unexpectedly, my breath visible in small puffs as I shouldered my pack. Max circled my legs, whining softly. He'd been acting strange since we'd gotten out of the car, ears constantly swiveling toward sounds I couldn't hear, nose twitching at scents that meant nothing to me. I chalked it up to excitement. It had been too long since we'd been anywhere this wild. The trail wound deeper into the forest, marked sporadically by faded blazes on tree trunks. I'd studied the maps obsessively, planned our route to a remote clearing about 6 miles in where I could set up camp away from any other hikers. The path twisted through dense stands of hemlock and oak, the canopy so thick it turned the afternoon into perpetual twilight. That should have been my first warning. The darkness here felt wrong, not just the absence of light, but something actively malevolent about it. The shadows seemed to move independently of their sources, and more than once I found myself looking over my shoulder, certain I'd seen something just beyond my peripheral vision. Max stayed close, closer than usual. Normally, he'd range ahead, investigating every interesting smell and sound. Today, he pressed against my leg with each step, a low rumble in his throat that I'd never heard before. Not a growl, exactly, but something deeper, more primal. By the time we reached the clearing, the sun had disappeared behind the mountains. Though my watch showed only 4:30 p.m., the shadows had swallowed the forest whole, and I fumbled for my headlamp with fingers that shook more than they should have from just the cold. The clearing was smaller than it had appeared on the topographical map, maybe 30 feet across, surrounded by towering hemlocks that formed an almost perfect circle. Something about the symmetry bothered me. Trees don't grow in patterns like that naturally. The ground was covered in a thick layer of pine needles that crunched wetly under my boots, and when I knelt to clear a spot for my tent, my fingers came away black with something that wasn't quite soil. Max refused to enter the clearing at first. He sat at the tree line, whimpering, every muscle in his body rigid with tension. I had to coax him forward with treats, and even then he stayed within arm's reach of me, constantly looking back toward the trees as if expecting something to emerge from between them. Setting up camp took longer than it should have. My hands kept shaking, and not from the cold. Every time I turned my back to the forest, the hair on my neck stood up. The silence was absolute. No bird calls, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush, no wind in the trees. Just the sound of my own breathing and the wet crunch of pine needles under my feet. I'd brought a small camp stove, but decided to build a fire anyway. Something about the darkness here made me crave the warmth and light of flames. Max sat pressed against my leg as I gathered dry wood from the edge of the clearing, his body trembling with constant tension. The fire wouldn't catch at first. The wood was dry enough, and I'd built fires in worse conditions, but the flames kept sputtering out as if something was actively extinguishing them. When I finally got a small blaze going, the flames burned an odd blue-green color that cast sickly shadows across the clearing. I told myself it was just minerals in the wood, but the color made my stomach clench with unreasoning fear. As full darkness fell, the temperature plummeted. I zipped Max and myself into my four-season tent, but even with our combined body heat and my sleeping bag rated to 20 below, I couldn't stop shivering. Max lay pressed against me, his breathing quick and shallow, ears constantly swiveling toward sounds I couldn't hear. That's when the voices started. At first, I thought it was just wind in the trees, a low murmur that could have been branches rubbing together. But wind doesn't call your name. Wind doesn't laugh with the exact cadence of your dead father's chuckle, the one you haven't heard in 15 years but could never forget. David. Soft at first, almost swallowed by the night. David, come out here. Max's growl built to a snarl, his hackles raised in a ridge along his spine. He'd never shown aggression toward people before, but whatever was out there, he didn't consider it human. David, we're waiting for you. My father's voice, but wrong somehow. The pitch was right, the familiar hint of his Tennessee accent, but there was something underneath it. Something cold and hungry that made my skin crawl. Dad had died in a car accident when I was 19. There was no way his voice could be calling to me from a forest in Maryland. I pressed my eye to the tent's mesh window. The fire had died to barely glowing embers, but in its faint light I could see shapes moving at the edge of the clearing. Tall, thin figures that seemed to flow rather than walk, shifting in and out of focus like heat mirages. When I blinked hard and looked again, they were gone. Just stress, I whispered to myself, the words barely audible over Max's continued growling. Just tired and stressed and letting my imagination run wild. But the voices continued through the night. My mother, calling sweetly for me to come home. My college roommate Tom, laughing about some joke I couldn't quite remember. My ex-girlfriend Sarah, whispering my name with the same breathless urgency she'd used during our most intimate moments. All of them dead, all of them speaking with voices that were perfectly accurate except for that underlying wrongness, like a recording played slightly too slow. Max didn't sleep at all. He lay rigid against me, every muscle tensed, a continuous low growl rumbling in his chest. Twice during the night I felt him tense even further, his growl escalating to a barely contained snarl, and each time the voices stopped abruptly, as if whatever was making them had been startled into silence. Dawn came gray and cold, but I'd never been happier to see light. The voices had faded with the darkness, and the oppressive weight that had pressed down on the clearing all night lifted slightly. Max finally relaxed enough to sleep, though he twitched constantly and whimpered in his dreams. I should have packed up and left then. Every instinct I had screamed at me to get out of that place, to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever had been calling to me in the night. But I'm stubborn, always have been, and admitting that I'd been spooked by what was probably just wind and wildlife felt like the kind of weakness I'd been trying to escape by coming out here in the first place. So I stayed. The second day was worse. The silence that had seemed strange the day before became actively oppressive. Not just the absence of animal sounds, but a quality to the quiet that made my ears ring. When I spoke to Max, my voice seemed to be absorbed by the air itself, falling flat and lifeless. Max wouldn't eat. He sniffed at his food bowl, whined, and backed away as if the kibble had gone rotten. When I checked it, the food looked normal, but there was a smell to it, sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. I dumped it out and opened a new bag, but he wouldn't touch that either. Around noon, I decided to explore the area, hoping that movement would help shake off the growing dread that clung to me like a fever. Max followed reluctantly. Staying so close, he repeatedly tangled in my legs. We followed what looked like an old deer trail through the hemlocks, though I noticed there were no tracks in the soft earth, no droppings, no sign that any animals had passed this way recently. The trail led to a small creek, maybe 3 feet wide, running black water over smooth stones. Max approached the water, sniffed once, and backed away with his tail between his legs. When I knelt to look more closely, I understood why. The water was wrong. Not just the dark color, but the way it moved. Creek water should babble and splash over rocks. This moved with the silent, oily flow of something much thicker than water, and when I dipped my finger into it, the liquid clung to my skin with an almost magnetic pull. I jerked my hand back and wiped it frantically on my jeans, but the feeling of that dark water remained, a cold spot on my finger that wouldn't warm no matter how much I rubbed it. We followed the creek downstream for maybe half a mile before Max suddenly stopped, his body going rigid. His nose pointed toward something ahead of us, and when I looked, I saw it too. A figure standing in the creek. At first, I thought it was another hiker. The shape was human enough, tall, wearing what looked like dark clothing, standing perfectly still in the middle of the flowing water. But as we got closer, the details began to resolve into something that made my stomach turn. It was me. Not someone who looked like me. Me. Exact same height, same build, same jacket and hiking boots I was wearing. The figure stood with its back to us, but when I called out, it began to turn. I grabbed Max's collar and backed away before I could see its face. Some primal part of my brain screamed warnings that I shouldn't look, that seeing my own face on that thing would break something fundamental in my mind. Max needed no encouragement to retreat. He pulled so hard against his collar that he nearly dragged me off my feet in his eagerness to get away. We made it back to camp as the sun was setting, though it felt like we'd only been gone for an hour. My watch disagreed. Somehow it was almost 8 p.m. and I had no memory of the intervening time. Max pressed against my legs, shaking so hard I could hear his teeth chattering. That night the voices returned stronger than before. Not just my dead loved ones now, but my own voice calling from the darkness. "David, I'm lost. Help me find my way back." My voice, but spoken with a cadence that was almost right, but not quite. The emphasis fell on wrong syllables, and there was a breathless quality to it, as if whoever was speaking had to remember how to form each word. "David, something's wrong with me. I need help." Max had stopped growling. He lay pressed against me, trembling violently, his eyes wide and fixed on the tent wall as if he could see through it to whatever was speaking outside. "David, I can't find my way home. Why won't you help me?" The voice was getting closer. Through the mesh window, I could see a shape moving around the fire. My shape, walking in slow circles just at the edge of the light. It moved wrong, like it wasn't quite sure how joints were supposed to bend, and every few steps it would pause and cock its head at an angle that was just slightly too far to be natural. "David, I see you in there. Why won't you come out? I'm you. You can trust me." The thing wearing my face pressed closer to the tent. In the dying firelight, I could see its features clearly, and they were perfect replicas of my own except for the eyes. My eyes are brown. This thing's eyes were black, completely black, like deep water at night. "David, your dog is scared. Let me in so I can calm him down." At the mention of Max, the dog's trembling intensified. He pressed himself so tightly against me that I could feel his heartbeat hammering against my ribs. His eyes were locked on the tent wall where my doppelganger stood, and a thin whine escaped his throat. "Max knows I'm real," the thing continued, and its voice was shifting, becoming something that wasn't quite my voice anymore. "Dogs can sense these things. He knows I'm the real David." That's when Max lunged. He threw himself at the tent wall with such force that the fabric stretched and nearly tore. His snarls filled the small space with primal fury, and for a moment the thing outside stepped back. In that brief respite, I heard it laugh. My laugh, but wrong. Too long and with too many notes that human vocal cords couldn't produce. "Oh, that's good," it said, and now the voice was becoming something else entirely, something that hurt to hear. "That's very good. He'll make excellent bait." Max collapsed suddenly, his snarls cutting off mid-sound. His body went limp against me, and when I rolled him over, his eyes had rolled back in his head. He was breathing, but barely, each breath a labored rasp. "What did you do to him?" I shouted at the thing outside. "Nothing permanent," it replied, and now its voice was a horrible mixture of mine and something else, something that sounded like wind through a graveyard. "Yet. Come outside, David. Come outside and I'll let your dog live." I looked down at Max's unconscious form. In the 5 years I'd had him, he'd never shown fear of anything. He'd chased bears out of my yard, stood down aggressive dogs twice his size, and slept peacefully through thunderstorms that sent me diving under the covers. But whatever was outside had reduced him to a trembling wreck with just its presence. "Come outside, David. Don't make me come in there." The tent wall began to bulge inward as something pressed against it. Not like hands pushing, but like the fabric was being drawn from the inside, pulled by some force I couldn't understand. The stakes holding down the corners squeaked and shifted in the rocky soil. I fumbled for my hunting knife, a 4-inch blade that suddenly seemed pathetically inadequate. The metal was ice cold against my palm, and when I looked at it in the faint light, I saw that frost was forming along the blade despite the relatively warm night air. "I can smell your fear," the thing said, and now its voice came from all around the tent, as if it was circling us at impossible speed. "It's delicious. It's been so long since I've tasted fear this pure." The tent wall tore. Not cut or punctured, but simply came apart as if the fabric had aged decades in seconds. Through the ragged hole, I could see the thing that wore my face. In the dying firelight, it was almost perfect, except for those black eyes and the way its smile was just a little too wide, showing teeth that were slightly too sharp. "Hello, David," it said, and reached through the hole with fingers that were too long and ended in nails that had never been human. I slashed at the reaching hand with my knife. The blade connected, but instead of blood, a black substance leaked from the wound, the same oily liquid I'd seen in the creek. The thing pulled its hand back and laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Iron," it said, looking at the wound with something like admiration. "Clever, but not nearly enough." It began to push through the tear in the tent wall, its body flowing like liquid as it squeezed through the opening. Up close, I could see more of the wrongness in its features. The skin was too pale, almost translucent, and underneath I could see dark veins pulsing with that same black fluid. Its hair was exactly like mine, but each strand moved independently, like seaweed in a current. Max stirred beside me, his eyes fluttering open. The moment he saw the thing, he let out a sound I'd never heard from any dog, a howl of pure terror that seemed to go on forever. The sound galvanized me into action. I grabbed Max under his front legs and dove out the back of the tent, cutting through the fabric with my knife. The thing wearing my face shrieked with rage, a sound that had nothing human in it, and gave chase. I ran blindly through the forest, carrying 60 pounds of semi-conscious dog, driven by panic and adrenaline. Behind me, I could hear the thing crashing through the underbrush, but the sounds were wrong. Too fast, too fluid, like it was flowing over the ground rather than running. Branches tore at my face and clothing. Roots caught my feet and sent me stumbling. Max gradually regained consciousness and began struggling in my arms, but he was too weak to support his own weight. His nose was bleeding and his eyes couldn't seem to focus on anything. The sounds of pursuit were getting closer. Whatever that thing was, it was faster than any human could be. I needed to find shelter, somewhere I could make a stand or at least slow it down. Through the trees ahead, I saw the faint reflection of water, the creek. The black water looked even more ominous in the darkness, but I was out of options. I splashed into the shallow creek, hoping the running water might slow the thing down. Some old folklore suggested supernatural creatures couldn't cross running water, though I wasn't sure if those rules applied to whatever was hunting me. The moment my feet hit the water, pain shot up my legs like electric shocks. The black liquid was cold beyond description, a cold that burned through my boots and jeans and seemed to freeze my bones. Max whimpered and tried to scramble out of my arms, but I held him tight. Behind us, the crashing sound stopped abruptly. I looked back and saw the thing that wore my face standing at the edge of the creek. In the darkness, its black eyes seemed to glow with their own light. "You can't run forever, David," it called, but its voice was different now, strained as if speaking across the water required effort. "I can wait. I have all the time in the world." I waded downstream, each step agony as the black water burned my legs. Max was getting heavier, and my arms were cramping from carrying him, but I didn't dare set him down in this water. Whatever it was clearly toxic to living things. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I saw something ahead that made my heart skip. A small bridge, barely more than fallen logs lashed together with rope, but spanning the creek about 6 feet above the water. If I could reach it, maybe I could get out of this poisonous stream. The climb to the bridge was treacherous. The creek banks were steep and slippery, covered in the same black substance that flowed in the water. I had to set Max down long enough to pull myself up, and the moment his paws touched the black liquid, he yelped and began convulsing. I hauled him up as quickly as I could, but the damage was done. The pads of his feet were burned, black and blistered where they'd contacted the water. He couldn't put weight on them, and when he tried to stand, he collapsed immediately. From the bridge, I could see back along the creek. The thing was following us, but it wasn't using the water. Instead, it flowed along the bank, sometimes appearing as my familiar form, sometimes as something else entirely. A writhing mass of shadow with too many limbs and eyes that reflected the faint starlight like a spider's. "You're only making this harder on yourself," it called, and now its voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. "I just want to borrow your shape for a while. Think of it as sharing." I picked up Max and kept running. The bridge led to an old logging road, overgrown but still clear enough to follow. My legs burned where the black water had soaked through my jeans, and I could feel blisters forming on my feet inside my boots. The road climbed steadily upward, and I hoped it would lead back toward the main trail. Max was conscious but barely responsive, his breathing shallow and labored. Every few minutes he would convulse and more blood would trickle from his nose. Behind us, I could hear the thing keeping pace effortlessly. Sometimes it would call out in my voice, sometimes in voices I didn't recognize. Once, horribly, it spoke in Max's bark, a perfect imitation that made my dog lift his head and whine in confusion. The road crested a hill and began to descend toward what looked like an old cabin. The structure was dark, but it appeared solid, and more importantly, it had 4 walls and a door I could bar against whatever was following us. The cabin was older than I'd thought, probably dating back to the Depression era when people still tried to scratch out livings in these remote mountains. The door was locked, but the wood around the latch was rotted enough that I could kick it in. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of long decay. My phone's flashlight revealed a single room with a stone fireplace, a few pieces of ancient furniture, and walls covered in old newspaper for insulation. I could read some of the headlines: stock market crashes, Dust Bowl reports, the kind of news that spoke of hard times and desperate people. I set Max down on what had once been a bed and barricaded the door with a heavy wooden table. My dog's condition was getting worse. His breathing was increasingly labored, and his eyes had developed the same glassy quality I'd seen in the black water. Through the cabin's single window, I could see something moving in the darkness outside. The thing had found us, and it was no longer bothering to maintain my form. What circled the cabin was shadow given shape, flowing and shifting like smoke, but with a predatory intelligence that made my skin crawl. "David," it called, and its voice was my father's again. "Son, you need to let me in. It's cold out here." I pressed my back against the door and tried to think. Iron had hurt it, but I only had one knife and the thing was clearly stronger and faster than I was. The cabin felt like a trap. I'd bought myself a few minutes, but there was nowhere to run from here. "David, your mother's worried about you. She sent me to bring you home." Max lifted his head weakly and looked toward the window. His eyes were clearing slightly and some of the intelligence was returning to his gaze. He tried to stand, managed to get his front legs under him, but his rear legs were still too weak to support his weight. "Good boy," I whispered, scratching behind his ears. "You're okay. We're going to be okay." But I didn't believe it. The thing outside was just toying with us now, like a cat with a cornered mouse. I could hear it moving around the cabin, testing the walls, looking for weak points. The newspaper covering the walls rustled and cracked as something pressed against them from outside. That's when I noticed the writing. Hidden under layers of old newspaper were words carved directly into the wooden walls. I peeled back a section of the 1932 Baltimore Sun and found crude letters gouged deep into the logs. "It takes your shape." Below that, in different handwriting, "John disappeared May 15th, 1943. Came back May 20th. Weren't John. Killed Sarah. Killed baby Ruth." More writing, different hands, different dates. "Fire don't work. Silver don't work. Tried to kill it 1961. It killed everyone instead. Don't let it see your face. It learns from looking." The most recent carving was dated just 3 years ago. Lisa Chen, age 22. If you're reading this, I'm probably dead. The thing outside isn't human. It's been here for decades. It takes people's shapes and uses them to hunt. I saw it kill my boyfriend. Now it looks like him. Now it looks like me too. Below that, in the same hand but obviously written later, "It's been 3 days. I can hear myself outside, calling for help. Don't listen. Don't look. When the sun comes up, run." My hands shook as I read the messages. Decades of people had found this cabin, had faced the same thing I was facing now, and based on the evidence, none of them had survived. "David, I know you're reading those old stories," the thing called from outside, and its voice was mine again. "People love to exaggerate. Most of them died because they panicked. You're smarter than that." I kept peeling back newspaper looking for more clues. Some of the writing was too faded to read, but one message near the fireplace was still clear. "The mine. Old iron mine, half-mile north. Cold iron hurts it. Trapped it, there before. 1889. It got out. Try again." A mine. I'd seen references to old mining operations in this area when I'd researched the region. Iron ore mining, mostly, back in the 1800s when people still thought they could pull wealth from these mountains. "David, your dog is dying," the thing said. and its voice held perfectly mimicked concern. "I can smell his blood from here. Let me in, and I'll help him." I looked at Max. He was worse, much worse. The black substance was spreading under his skin like ink through water, creating dark veins that pulsed with each labored heartbeat. His breathing was becoming increasingly shallow, and blood was flowing steadily from his nose now. The thing was right. Max was dying, and I didn't know how to help him, but letting that creature into the cabin would mean death for both of us. "I know what you're thinking," the thing continued, and now its voice held a note of glee. "You're thinking about that old mine. You're thinking cold iron might stop me." It laughed, a sound like wind through a cemetery. "David, David, David, do you really think no one has tried that before? That mine is full of the bones of people who thought they were clever." But something in its tone suggested I was on the right track. If the mine was such a dead end, why was it trying so hard to talk me out of going there? I found more writing near the floor. "The mine shaft goes deep. Cold iron ore in the walls. Thing can't change shape down there. Gets trapped in whatever form it's wearing. Has to climb out the long way." Below that, in different handwriting, "Sealed the entrance with iron bars 1923. Thing broke out 1924. Needs something stronger." And at the bottom, nearly illegible, "Explosives worked. Collapsed half the mine, 1967. Thing still got out. Always gets out." Outside, the sounds of movement stopped. The sudden silence was somehow more terrifying than the constant circling had been. I pressed my eye to a gap in the newspaper covering the window and tried to see what was happening. The thing stood directly in front of the cabin now, perfectly still, wearing my exact appearance. But as I watched, it began to change. The features shifted slowly, like wax melting and reforming. My face became someone else's. A young woman with short brown hair and terrified eyes. Then it changed again, becoming an older man with a grizzled beard. Then a child, maybe 10 years old, with a gap-toothed smile. It was cycling through its victims, showing me the faces of everyone it had killed and replaced over the decades. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Men, women, children, all of them staring at me with empty black eyes that reflected no light. "See them all, David?" it asked, and its voice was a horrible chorus of every person it had ever imitated. They all thought they were smarter than me. They all thought they could escape. Max stirred beside me, his eyes opening with more clarity than I'd seen since the thing had first appeared. He looked at me, then toward the window where the creature stood, and I saw something in his gaze that might have been understanding. He knew we were going to die here unless I did something. The dog struggled to his feet, his legs shaking with the effort. The black veins under his skin were spreading faster now, reaching toward his heart, but there was still fight left in him. He looked at me and then toward the door, and somehow I understood what he was suggesting. A distraction. "Max, no," I whispered, but he was already moving. With strength I didn't know he still possessed, Max threw himself against the barricaded door. The table I'd used to block it shifted slightly, and through the gap I could see the thing's head snap toward the sound. "The dog wants to play," it said, and began moving toward the door. How delightful. I grabbed my knife and what few supplies I could carry quickly. Water, the emergency flare from my pack, my phone with its dying battery. Max was throwing himself against the door repeatedly now, each impact weaker than the last but still drawing the creature's attention. There was a small window at the back of the cabin, partially hidden behind a pile of old furniture. I'd noticed it earlier but dismissed it as too small to climb through. Now it looked like my only chance. I squeezed through the window as quietly as I could, dropping into the undergrowth behind the cabin. Through the walls, I could hear the thing trying to get through the door, and Max's increasingly desperate attempts to keep it focused there. The old mine was supposed to be half a mile north. In the darkness, with no clear trail to follow, that might as well have been half a continent. But I had to try. If the mine really could trap the thing, it might be my only chance to save Max. I ran through the forest, guided by my phone's compass and what little starlight filtered through the canopy. Behind me, I heard the cabin door finally give way, followed by a shriek of rage that definitely hadn't come from Max. My dog's yelp of pain cut through the night like a blade, and I almost turned back. But Max had bought me this chance with his sacrifice. I couldn't waste it. The forest here was different from where we'd been camping. Older, with massive trees that must have been growing since before the first European settlers reached these mountains. The undergrowth was thicker too, forcing me to push through tangles of thorns and vines that seemed to grab at my clothes with deliberate malice. My phone's battery died after 20 minutes, leaving me to navigate by starlight and instinct. The cold was getting worse, though that might have been shock setting in. Every shadow looked like the thing pursuing me, every sound like footsteps getting closer. But I found it. The mine entrance was a gaping wound in the hillside, maybe 6 feet wide and tall enough for a man to walk upright. Old wooden supports framed the opening, gray and weathered, but still standing after more than a century. And stretched across the entrance, just as the writing in the cabin had suggested, were iron bars, thick, hand-forged rods that had been driven deep into the rock on either side. The bars were broken. Not cut or bent, but shattered, as if something with impossible strength had simply grabbed them and pulled until the metal gave way. Pieces of iron lay scattered around the entrance, some driven deep into nearby trees by the force of the explosion that had broken them. I picked up one of the iron fragments. It was about 18 inches long and felt solid and reassuring in my hand. If iron really could hurt the thing, this was better than my knife. The mine shaft stretched into absolute darkness. My emergency flare would give me light, but once I lit it, there would be no hiding my location. I'd have maybe 15 minutes of illumination before it burned out, leaving me trapped in the dark with whatever was down there. Behind me, something was moving through the forest. Not the normal sounds of an animal. Too coordinated, too purposeful. The thing had found my trail. I lit the flare. Red light flared out, revealing the mine shaft in hellish detail. The walls were rough-hewn rock studded with veins of dark ore that might have been iron. Water dripped constantly from the ceiling, forming puddles that reflected the flare's light like blood. The air smelled of rust and decay and something else. Something sweet and cloying that reminded me of the rotting food smell from Max's bowl. I ran into the mine, the flare held high, iron rod gripped in my other hand. My footsteps echoed strangely in the confined space, the sound bouncing back from depths I couldn't see. How deep did this mine go? The messages in the cabin had mentioned the thing getting trapped down here, but they'd also mentioned it always finding a way out. 50 yards in, the main shaft branched into 3 smaller tunnels. I chose the center one arbitrarily and kept running. The walls here were different. The iron ore veins were thicker, and there was definitely something about them that felt oppressive, like a weight pressing down on my thoughts. Behind me, I heard the thing enter the mine. "David!" It was calling in Max's voice now, a perfect imitation of my dog's bark translated into human speech. "David, where are you? I'm hurt. I need help." The sound of Max's voice, even knowing it was fake, nearly broke my resolve. I wanted to turn back, to help my dog, even though I knew Max was probably already dead. The thing was using my love for him against me, and it was working. I forced myself to keep moving deeper into the mine. The flare was already burning lower, and I'd covered maybe 100 yards. How much further did these tunnels go? "David, please." The voice was closer now, echoing through the mine shafts. "It's dark down here. I'm scared." The tunnel I'd chosen ended abruptly in a wall of collapsed rock. A dead end. I'd have to go back and try one of the other branches, but that would mean passing close to whatever was following me. I pressed my back against the rock wall and listened. Footsteps echoed from the main tunnel, but they sounded wrong. Too light, as if whatever was making them didn't weigh as much as it should. And there were too many of them, like something with more than 2 legs trying to walk upright. The footsteps stopped. "I can smell you, David," the thing called, and its voice was my father's again. "You can't hide in here forever. That flare won't last much longer." It was right. The red light was dimming noticeably, and I had maybe 5 minutes before it burned out completely. Once I was in total darkness, the thing would have every advantage. I heard it moving again, exploring the side tunnels. It would find me soon. That's when I noticed the air current. Even pressed against the collapsed wall, I could feel a faint breeze against my face. Air was moving through the rocks, which meant there might be another way out, or at least another chamber beyond the collapse. I set the flare down and ran my hands over the rock pile. The stones were loose, just balanced against each other. Some of them shifted when I pushed, and through the gaps between them the air current was stronger. I started pulling rocks away from the wall as quietly as I could. They were heavier than they looked, and several times I nearly sent the whole pile cascading down in an avalanche that would have revealed my location instantly. "David?" The thing's voice was very close now, just around the corner from my tunnel. "I found something interesting. Want to see?" I didn't answer, didn't even breathe. Through the gap I'd opened in the rock pile, more air was flowing. Not just a breeze now, but a steady wind that suggested a large open space beyond. "I found your dog," the thing continued conversationally. "Well, most of him. He put up quite a fight. You should be proud." My hands clenched around the iron rod, and it took everything I had not to charge around the corner and try to kill the thing. But that's what it wanted, for me to lose control, to attack without thinking. I'd seen how fast it could move. In a straight fight, I'd last maybe 10 seconds. Instead, I kept pulling rocks away from the wall. The gap was almost wide enough for me to squeeze through now, and the wind from beyond was getting stronger. Whatever was back there, it was big. "He called for you at the end," the thing said, and now its voice was closer, definitely in my tunnel. "Called and called, but you'd already abandoned him. Some friend you are." I could see light reflecting off the tunnel walls. Not my dying flare, but something else. The thing was carrying its own illumination, though I couldn't tell what kind. The gap in the rock pile was just wide enough. I grabbed my flare and squeezed through, feeling sharp stones tear at my jacket and skin. On the other side was a natural cavern, much larger than the mine tunnels, with a ceiling that disappeared into darkness above. And it was full of bones. Not just human bones, though there were plenty of those. Animal bones too. Deer, bear, smaller creatures I couldn't identify. All of them picked clean and arranged in careful piles along the cavern walls. Some of the human skulls still had scraps of cloth and hair attached, and I could see that the damage wasn't from time or animals. These people had been killed violently, their bones broken and scattered. This was the thing's larder, its feeding ground. At the center of the cavern was a pool of the same black liquid I'd seen in the creek. It was perfectly circular, maybe 20 feet across, and absolutely still. No ripples, no movement at all, as if the surface was solid rather than liquid. My flare was almost dead now, just a sputtering red glow that barely illuminated the nearest bone piles. In maybe 2 minutes, I'd be in complete darkness with a creature that had been hunting in these caves for over a century. That's when I heard the scraping sound behind me. The thing was pulling rocks away from the gap I'd created, widening it enough for its own passage. I could hear it laughing softly to itself as it worked, a sound like wind through a broken window. "Very clever, David," it called through the gap. "I haven't had anyone find the feeding chamber in decades. You should feel honored. This is where I keep my favorites." The scraping stopped. Light began to spill through the gap, much brighter than my dying flare. The thing squeezed through the opening and stood up in the cavern, and I saw what had been providing its illumination. It was covered in some kind of phosphorescent substance that made its skin glow with a sickly green light. In the brighter illumination, I could see that it wasn't trying to maintain any particular human shape anymore. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, with limbs that were too long and joints that bent in directions that made my eyes water to look at. But the worst part was the faces. Its flesh rippled constantly, and faces pressed against it from the inside, the faces of its victims trying to break through to the surface. I could see the young woman from outside the cabin, the old man with the beard, dozens of others, all of them screaming silently as they pushed against the thing's skin like drowning people trying to break the surface of a lake. "Welcome to my home," it said, and its voice was a chorus of all those trapped faces. "You're going to love it here. Forever." My flare sputtered and went out. In the sudden darkness, the thing's phosphorescent glow was the only light. It began to move toward me, not walking but flowing across the cavern floor like spilled water. I backed away, iron rod raised, until I felt the edge of the black pool against my heels. "Nowhere to run now," the thing said. "But don't worry, the pool is very deep. Your bones will join the others and your face will join my collection. I'll wear it well when I leave this place." It was almost close enough to touch when I heard the sound. A bark. Weak, distant, but unmistakably Max. The thing stopped moving and cocked its head like a hunting dog. "Impossible," it whispered. "I killed it. I tore its throat out." The bark came again, echoing from somewhere in the mine tunnels. Closer this time. "Max?" I called, not daring to hope. An answering bark, definitely closer. And then I heard the sound of claws on stone, getting rapidly nearer. The thing spun toward the gap in the rocks, its faces contorting with rage. It should be dead. I felt its life leave. Max burst through the gap like a furry missile, moving faster than I'd ever seen him move. But he was wrong somehow. The black veins under his skin were glowing now, pulsing with the same phosphorescent light as the creature, and his eyes, when they reflected the thing's glow, weren't brown anymore. They were silver. Max hit the creature at full speed, knocking it backward toward the pool. But instead of biting or clawing, he did something I'd never seen him do before. He spoke. "Iron hurts," he said in a voice that was definitely his bark but somehow translated into human speech. "Cold iron burns, but silver kills?" The thing shrieked and tried to throw Max off, but my dog's claws had found purchase in the creature's shifting flesh. Where his nails touched, the phosphorescent glow sputtered and dimmed. "The mine," Max continued, his voice growing stronger. "Not iron ore, silver ore. They lied in the stories. They had to lie, or it would have learned." Understanding hit me like a physical blow. The messages in the cabin, the stories about iron, they'd been deliberately misleading. The real trap wasn't iron at all. It was silver. And somehow, contact with the creature's poison had changed Max, given him the ability to hurt it. I raised the iron rod, but Max barked a warning. "No, iron feeds it. Silver starves it." Instead, I looked around desperately for anything silver. My watch, it had a silver band. I tore it off my wrist and threw it at the struggling creatures. Where the metal touched the thing's skin, the flesh sizzled and burned like acid. The creature's scream was so loud it brought down rocks from the cavern ceiling. It threw Max off and staggered backward, but my dog was already moving, circling like he was herding sheep. Every time the thing tried to move away from the pool, Max was there, forcing it back. "The pool," Max said urgently. "Not water, liquid silver, old mining process. Drives it back to where it came from." The thing spun toward me, its face cycling rapidly through its victims. "You don't understand," it shrieked. "I'm not the monster here. I'm a refugee. My world was destroyed. This is the only way I can survive." For a moment, I almost felt sorry for it. But then, I saw the bone piles around the cavern, remembered the faces of all its victims pressing against its flesh, and hardened my heart. "Find another way," I said, and shoved it backward into the pool. The creature hit the silver liquid with a splash that sent droplets flying across the cavern floor. Where the silver touched the bones, they began to dissolve. Decades of remains finally finding peace. The thing thrashed in the pool, its form becoming less and less solid with each passing second. "This isn't over," it screamed as it sank. "There are others. My kind is coming. This world will—" The silver closed over its head, and the cavern fell silent. Max collapsed beside me, the silver glow in his veins fading to normal brown eyes. He was badly hurt, I could see that the creature's attack had done serious damage, but he was alive, and he was himself again. "Good boy," I whispered, scratching behind his ears. "Such a good boy." We made our way out of the mine slowly, both of us exhausted and injured. Dawn was breaking as we emerged, painting the forest in shades of gold and red that seemed impossibly beautiful after the horror of the caves. My truck was where I'd left it, though it felt like a lifetime ago that I'd parked there. Max needed a vet, and I needed to figure out how to explain what had happened without sounding completely insane. But as I helped Max into the passenger seat, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Scratched into the dirt beside my truck were words in the same script I'd seen carved into the cabin walls. "They come in the dark of the moon." This was just the first. I looked up at the sky. The moon was barely a sliver, waning toward new. We had maybe 2 weeks. I started the truck and drove toward town, Max sleeping fitfully beside me. In the rearview mirror, I could see the mine entrance, dark and quiet now. But I knew that wouldn't last. Whatever that thing had been, it wasn't alone. And somehow, I'd become the only person who knew they were coming. The road stretched ahead of us, leading back to civilization and safety. But I knew now that safety was an illusion. The real question wasn't whether we'd escaped. The question was whether we'd live long enough to warn anyone else. In his sleep, Max whimpered and pressed closer to me. His fur still carried the faint scent of that otherworldly corruption, but underneath it was the familiar smell of my dog, loyal, brave, and alive against all odds. Whatever was coming, we'd face it together. But first, we needed to find more silver. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in Green Ridge State Forest, Maryland, in the most remote section where the Appalachian Trail cuts through 10,000 acres of unforgiving wilderness. We should have turned back when Jennifer's GPS started showing us walking in circles. We should have packed up when Brian's compass began spinning like a broken toy. But we didn't. God help us, we didn't. It was supposed to be a simple 3-day camping trip. Me, Jennifer Adams, Brian Wright, and Sarah Rodriguez. We'd been friends since college, and this annual October tradition had become sacred to us. Green Ridge was perfect. Isolated, challenging, and far enough from civilization that we could pretend the world beyond these mountains didn't exist. The trailhead at 15 Mile Creek was empty when we arrived Friday afternoon. The park ranger, a weathered man with eyes like chips of flint, checked our permits with unusual thoroughness. "You folks planning to camp near Devil's Backbone Ridge?" he asked, studying our planned route. "That's the idea," Jennifer replied, adjusting her pack straps. She was our group's navigator, a software engineer who approached hiking with military precision. "Why?" The ranger's jaw worked silently for a moment. "Had some reports of unusual activity up there. Might want to stick to the marked trails." "What kind of activity?" Sarah pressed. As a nurse, she had little patience for vague warnings. "Animals acting strange. Disappearances." His eyes moved between us. "Last month, a hiker went missing for 3 days. When we found him, he was different. Wouldn't speak about what happened, just kept saying he was hungry. Real hungry." Brian laughed, but it sounded forced. "Come on, man. You trying to scare us with some local legend?" The ranger didn't smile. "Just keep your food secured. And if you hear anything unusual at night, stay in your tents." We should have listened. The hike to our chosen campsite took 4 hours through dense forest that seemed to swallow sound. Ancient oaks and maples formed a canopy so thick that even midday felt like twilight. The temperature had dropped to 15 degrees from the parking lot, and our breath began to mist as afternoon faded. "This place gives me the creeps," Sarah admitted as we crossed a stream via fallen logs. The water beneath was black as tar, reflecting nothing. "It's just remote," Jennifer said, but I caught her glancing over her shoulder. "That's what we wanted, right?" Brian, usually our group's comedian, had been unusually quiet since leaving the trailhead. He kept stopping to study the trees, his head tilted like he was listening for something we couldn't hear. "Everything okay?" I asked during one of these pauses. Yeah, just... He frowned. Do you smell that? I inhaled deeply. Pine needles, damp earth, the crisp scent of approaching winter. Smell what? Never mind. But his expression remained troubled. We reached our campsite, a small clearing beside what our map labeled as Whispering Creek, just as true darkness began to fall. The creek was barely a trickle, probably seasonal and eerily silent despite the moving water. No frogs, no insects, no night sounds at all. Setting up camp felt wrong from the start. My tent stakes kept hitting rocks that weren't there moments before. Jennifer's GPS flickered between different coordinates, none of them matching our paper map. Sarah's water purification tablets turned the creek water an unnatural green color before settling clear. Anyone else notice how quiet it is? Brian asked as we gathered around our campfire. The flames cast dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of the firelight. He was right. The silence was oppressive, like the forest was holding its breath. Even our own voices seemed muffled, as if the darkness was absorbing sound. Probably just the elevation, Jennifer said, though she kept glancing at her GPS with a puzzled expression. Technology gets weird in remote areas. I pulled out my phone to check the time. Dead, completely drained despite being fully charged that morning. That's strange. My phone just died. The others checked theirs, all dead. Solar flare activity, maybe? Sarah suggested, but uncertainty crept into her voice. We ate our first night's meal, freeze-dried pasta and canned soup, in relative silence. The food tasted flat, metallic, like it had been sitting in our mouths too long before we swallowed. Even the marshmallows we roasted for dessert had an acrid aftertaste. I'll take first watch, Brian volunteered as we prepared for bed. Watch for what? Jennifer asked. Bears, you know. But his eyes kept darting to the tree line. I was exhausted, but sleep wouldn't come. Through my tent walls I could hear Brian moving around the campsite, his footsteps crunching on leaves that sounded strangely wet. The fire crackled occasionally, but no light reached my tent. How could a fire burn without giving off light? Around 2 a.m., I heard Brian talking to someone in hushed tones. The words were indistinct, but his voice carried an odd cadence, like he was responding to questions I couldn't hear. I unzipped my tent flap slightly and peered out. Brian stood with his back to me at the edge of the firelight, speaking to empty air. As I watched, he nodded several times, then walked into the darkness beyond our camp. His footsteps faded quickly, swallowed by the unnatural silence. I waited for him to return. Minutes passed, then an hour. The fire had died to embers, but I could still see perfectly. Everything had a strange silver quality like moonlight, though the sky was overcast. When Brian finally emerged from the tree line, something was wrong. He moved differently, too smoothly, like his joints were oiled. And when he turned toward my tent, his eyes reflected the dying firelight like an animal's. I pretended to sleep when he passed my tent, but I heard him pause outside for several long minutes. Through the thin nylon, I could swear I heard him sniffing. Morning came too early and too bright. I emerged from my tent feeling like I hadn't slept at all, my mouth dry and tasting of copper. The others were already awake, but the mood was subdued. "Sleep, okay?" Jennifer asked, stirring instant coffee over our rekindled fire. "Fine," I lied. "Brian, did you leave camp last night?" He looked up from his breakfast with a blank expression. "What? No. Why would I do that?" "I thought I heard you talking to someone. Must have been dreaming." His smile was too wide, showing too many teeth. "You know how sound carries out here." But Sarah was staring at Brian with a nurse's trained eye for symptoms. "You look pale. Are you feeling all right?" "Never better." Another too wide smile. "Actually, I'm starving. This food tastes amazing." He was eating our protein bars like they were candy, wrapper and all in some cases. When Sarah pointed this out, he laughed and claimed he was just really hungry. Our second day's hike was supposed to take us to Devil's Backbone Ridge, a granite outcropping with panoramic views of the Cumberland Valley. But our map no longer made sense. Trails that should have led east curved back south. Elevation markers were contradictory. Jennifer's carefully planned route had become meaningless. "This is impossible," she muttered, comparing her GPS to the paper map. "According to this, we're walking in a perfect circle, but we've been heading uphill for 2 hours." Brian, who had been lagging behind all morning, suddenly appeared beside us without any of us noticing his approach. "Maybe we should split up, cover more ground." "Absolutely not," Sarah said firmly. "First rule of hiking, stay together." "Come on," Brian pressed, and there was something hungry in his voice. "Jennifer and I could scout ahead while you two set up an early camp." "No." I was surprised by the vehemence in my own voice. Something deep in my brain was screaming warnings I didn't understand. "We stick together." Brian's face darkened for just a moment, a flash of something that wasn't quite human, before the friendly mask returned. Sure, just trying to be efficient." By afternoon, we were completely lost. Worse, our supplies were disappearing. Sarah's medical kit vanished from her pack during a rest stop, though she swore she'd checked it minutes earlier. Half our food had spoiled overnight, developing fuzzy black mold despite being sealed in waterproof containers. And Brian kept wandering off. "Where's Brian?" became our constant refrain. He would be there one moment, gone the next, always reappearing with leaves in his hair and dirt under his fingernails. Each time he claimed he'd just been checking something out or gathering firewood, but he never brought anything back. The third disappearance happened while we were filtering water from a small stream. I turned to ask Brian to grab the purification tablets, and he was gone. Not walking away, not stepping behind a tree, just gone, like he'd never been there at all. "Brian," Jennifer called, "this isn't funny." No response. The forest swallowed our voices. "He was right here," Sarah whispered, "right here. I was looking at him." We searched for an hour, calling his name until our throats were raw. The temperature was dropping fast and clouds were gathering for what looked like a serious storm. We had no choice but to make camp and hope he'd find us. That night, the hunger started. It began as ordinary appetite, the kind you'd expect after a day of hiking. But it grew, gnawing at our stomachs like a living thing. We ate everything we had left: crackers, energy bars, even Brian's abandoned supplies, but the hunger only intensified. "This doesn't make sense," Sarah panted, clutching her stomach. "We just ate. We should be full." Jennifer was digging through her pack again, looking for anything edible. "Maybe it's the altitude, or stress." I felt it too, a desperate, clawing need for food that went beyond physical hunger. It was like my body was forgetting how to process nutrients, demanding more and more while providing less and less satisfaction. Then we heard Brian calling for help. His voice came from somewhere deeper in the forest, echoing strangely off the trees. He sounded terrified, desperate. "We have to help him," Sarah said, grabbing her flashlight. "Wait." Something in Brian's voice bothered me. It was too perfect. The exact pitch and cadence of genuine fear, but somehow artificial, like a recording. "He could be hurt," Jennifer argued. The calls continued, growing more frantic. But as I listened, I realized they were coming from different directions. Sometimes north, sometimes south, sometimes from directly above us in the canopy. "That's not Brian," I said quietly. "What do you mean?" Sarah demanded. "Listen, really listen." We stood silent as Brian's voice called for help from 6 different locations simultaneously. The sound was identical each time, the same inflection, the same words, like an audio file being played on repeat. Then silence. Jennifer's hands were shaking as she gripped her flashlight. "What's happening here?" Before I could answer, footsteps approached our campsite. Slow, deliberate, with that same too smooth quality I'd noticed before. Brian emerged from the darkness, clothes torn and dirty, a wide smile on his face. "Sorry, I'm late," he said cheerfully. "Got a little turned around." "Where were you?" Sarah demanded. "We've been looking for hours." "Just exploring." He sat down by our fire as if nothing had happened. "Find anything interesting while I was gone?" That's when I noticed his eyes. In the firelight, they were wrong. Too reflective, like there was something metallic behind the irises. And when he smiled, I glimpsed teeth that seemed too sharp, too numerous. "Brian," I said carefully, "what did you have for breakfast this morning?" He tilted his head, still smiling. "The usual. Why?" "What usual? Be specific." For just a moment, his expression flickered with confusion. Then the smile returned, broader than before. "You know, the camping food, the good stuff." Jennifer was backing away slowly. She'd noticed it too. "Brian, what's my middle name?" "Your middle name?" Another flicker of confusion. It's the one you always use." "He doesn't know," Sarah whispered. "Oh God, he doesn't know." The thing wearing Brian's face turned toward her, and its smile became something terrible. "Of course I know. I know everything about you, Sarah. I know you taste like fear and copper pennies when you cry." That's when it lunged. The creature moved with inhuman speed, crossing the 10 feet between us in a single bound. Its fingers had become claws, and its mouth had split open to reveal rows of needle-sharp teeth. Sarah screamed as it knocked her to the ground. I grabbed a burning log from the fire and swung it like a club. The flames connected with the creature's shoulder and it shrieked, a sound like breaking glass mixed with animal howls. The impact sent it rolling away from Sarah, but it was back on its feet instantly. "Run!" I shouted. We scattered into the darkness, leaving our gear behind. Behind us, the thing that had been Brian let out a hunting cry that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Tree branches whipped past my face as I stumbled through the underbrush, following the faint glow of Jennifer's flashlight ahead. "This way," she called. "There's a trail." But when we reached what should have been a trail, we found only more trees. The forest seemed to be shifting around us, paths appearing and disappearing like mirages. My lungs burned, and the hunger was getting worse, gnawing at my insides with increasing violence. "We're running in circles," Sarah gasped. She was right. Despite running for what felt like miles, we kept passing the same fallen log, the same distinctive boulder, the same dead tree split by lightning. The forest was playing with us. Then Jennifer's flashlight died. Darkness slammed down like a physical weight. Without the artificial light, the world became alien. Shapes that might have been trees or might have been something worse. Sounds that could have been wind or could have been breathing. "Stay together," I whispered. "Hold hands. Don't let go." We linked ourselves into a chain. Sarah's grip so tight it cut off circulation to my fingers. Behind us, something was following. Not footsteps exactly, but a rhythmic scraping, like claws on bark. "I can see light ahead," Jennifer whispered. She was right. Through the trees, a warm glow beckoned. It looked like civilization, maybe a ranger station or another camping area. We moved toward it, trying to stay quiet, trying not to think about what might be hunting us. The light came from our own campsite. Somehow, despite hours of running in different directions, we'd come full circle. Our tents stood exactly as we'd left them, the fire burning merrily. And sitting beside it, roasting a marshmallow on a stick, was Brian. "There you are," he called cheerfully. "I was wondering when you'd get back. Dinner's almost ready." He looked completely normal. No claws, no too wide smile, no reflecting eyes. Just Brian, our friend, acting like nothing had happened. "That's impossible," Sarah breathed. "We saw you. You were..." "I was what?" Brian's expression was genuinely confused. "I've been here the whole time, wondering where you guys went. You left all your stuff." I studied his face in the firelight. The eyes were normal. The teeth were normal. Even his mannerisms were exactly right. The way he tilted his head when he was confused, the nervous laugh he gave when he was embarrassed. "Brian," Jennifer said slowly. "What's my middle name?" "Marie," he said immediately. "Jennifer Marie Adams. You hate it because it sounds old-fashioned." It was correct. Everything about him was correct. "I think I'm losing my mind," Sarah whispered. We sat around the fire in stunned silence, trying to make sense of what had happened. Brian seemed genuinely concerned about our adventure in the woods, offering us food and water, checking Sarah's scraped hands where she'd fallen. But I couldn't shake the memory of those claws, those teeth, and the hunger was still there, stronger than ever. My stomach felt like it was trying to digest itself. "We need to leave," I said finally. "First thing in the morning, we pack up and get out of here." "But we still have 2 days," Brian protested, "and I'm just starting to enjoy myself." There was something in the way he said "enjoy" that made my skin crawl. We took shifts watching that night, though we didn't say that's what we were doing. I volunteered for the first shift, claiming I was too wired to sleep. Brian went to his tent cheerfully enough, but I noticed he didn't zip it closed. Around midnight, I heard him talking again. Soft murmurs like he was on a phone call. But we had no cell service and our phones were dead anyway. I crept closer to his tent, trying to make out the words. "Yes, they suspect. No, not yet. Soon. So hungry." I pulled back quickly, my heart hammering. When I looked again, Brian's tent was silent and dark. Morning brought no relief. Our remaining food had spoiled overnight, despite being stored properly. Every can was bloated with botulism, every package was crawling with maggots that hadn't been there the night before. We had water, but no food for the hike out. "That's okay," Brian said, far too cheerfully for someone facing a day-long hike on an empty stomach. "I know where we can find something to eat." "Where?" Jennifer asked. Brian's smile was warm and friendly and absolutely terrifying. "There's plenty of fresh meat around here. You just have to know where to look." We packed in tense silence. Every minute in this place felt like borrowed time, like the forest itself was deciding whether to let us leave. The hunger was so intense now that I could barely concentrate on simple tasks. As we prepared to break camp, Brian announced he needed to grab something from the woods real quick. "No," I said immediately. "We stick together. It'll just take a second." "No." I stepped between him and the tree line. "Whatever it is can wait until we're home." For just a moment, something flickered across Brian's face, something cold and alien and infinitely patient. Then the friendly mask snapped back into place. "Sure thing, Mike. Let's get going." The hike out became a nightmare of wrong turns and impossible geography. Trails we'd taken to reach our campsite no longer existed. Our compass spun wildly, settling on directions that contradicted our map. The GPS Jennifer had borrowed from her brother showed us walking through empty space, miles from any marked trail. Worse, Brian kept disappearing. Not dramatically, just small lapses where he'd be there one moment and gone the next. Each time he'd reappear from a slightly different direction, always with an innocent explanation. Getting water from a stream we couldn't see, checking something that had caught his eye, just stepping behind a tree for privacy. But he never brought back water. There were no streams, and we never heard him walking away. By afternoon, we were completely lost and facing the reality that we might not make it out before dark. The hunger had progressed beyond physical discomfort into genuine pain. My vision was starting to blur, and Sarah was stumbling with exhaustion. That's when Brian made his suggestion. "You know," he said conversationally, "there might be an easier way." "What do you mean?" Jennifer asked. "Well, if we're really lost—" Brian paused, seeming to consider his words carefully. "Maybe we should consider other options for food." The silence that followed was deafening. "What kind of options?" Sarah asked, though her voice suggested she didn't want to know. Brian's smile was gentle, understanding. "I'm just saying, we're all really hungry, and there's plenty of fresh protein around." "Brian," I said slowly, "what exactly are you suggesting?" He gestured vaguely toward the forest. Animals. Hunting. You know. But the way he looked at us when he said it made it clear he wasn't talking about animals. We don't have weapons, Jennifer pointed out. We have hands, Brian replied. Teeth. It's amazing what people can do when they're really motivated. That's when I knew for certain that whatever was wearing Brian's face, it wasn't my friend. The attack came at sunset. We'd made another cold camp, huddled together for warmth and safety. Brian had been unusually quiet all evening, sitting apart from the group, staring into the darkness with an expression of intense concentration. I was trying to start a fire when I heard Jennifer scream. Brian had Sarah pinned to the ground, his hands around her throat. But his fingers were wrong. Too long, ending in black claws that were slowly extending from his nail beds. His mouth had split open along hidden seams, revealing that impossible array of needle teeth. So hungry, he whispered in a voice like grinding stone. So very, very hungry. I tackled him from the side, knocking him off Sarah. The impact should have sent him sprawling, but instead he rolled with inhuman grace and came up in a crouch, already turning toward me. This close, I could see that his eyes had no whites anymore, just black orbs that reflected our tiny fire like dark mirrors. And there was something else behind his face, something that pressed against his skin from the inside, distorting his features. You smell like fear, Michael, it said with Brian's voice. Fear and desperation and the salt taste of human tears. I've been saving you for last. Jennifer had grabbed a heavy branch and swung it at the creature's head. The wood connected with a sound like breaking pottery, and Brian's face shifted. For just a moment, I saw something else underneath, something with too many joints and skin like wet leather. Then it was Brian again, blood trickling from his temple, looking dazed and confused. What happened? He asked, staring at us in apparent shock. Why are you all looking at me like that? Get away from him, Sarah gasped, clutching her throat where finger-shaped bruises were already forming. Sarah? Are you hurt? I don't understand. The confusion seemed genuine. The concern in his voice was exactly right. But I'd seen what was underneath. You tried to kill her, I said. What? No, I would never. Sarah, I'm sorry. I don't know what happened. I must have had some kind of episode. Low blood sugar, maybe. He reached toward her and she flinched away. Please, he continued, tears starting to form in his eyes. I don't remember anything. I would never hurt any of you. You know that. And the terrible thing was, it sounded like the truth. Every word, every gesture, every expression was perfectly Brian. If I hadn't seen the transformation myself, I would have believed him completely. We need to get out of here, Jennifer said quietly. Now. At night, Brian protested. That's dangerous. We should wait for morning. No, I said firmly. We're leaving. Now. We grabbed our essential gear and left everything else. Brian followed us, maintaining a stream of worried chatter about the wisdom of night hiking, about Sarah's injuries, about staying together as a group. He sounded exactly like our friend would sound in this situation. But I kept watching his shadow in the moonlight, and sometimes it moved wrong. The forest at night was a maze of silver light and absolute darkness. Our flashlights created small bubbles of visibility in an ocean of black, and every step felt like it might be our last. Behind us, I could hear Brian talking. Normal conversation, asking about everyone's condition, suggesting rest stops. But between his words, I heard something else. Soft, clicking sounds like claws tapping against bark. And occasionally, when he thought we weren't listening, his voice would drop to a whisper, speaking words in no language I recognized. We'd been walking for 2 hours when Sarah collapsed. I can't, she gasped. I need to rest. She was pale and shaking, and the bruises on her neck had darkened to deep purple. But more than that, she looked hungry. Not just for food, but hungry in the same desperate way I felt. Just a few more minutes, Jennifer urged. We're almost... Almost where? Brian interrupted. We have no idea where we are. This is insanity. We keep moving, I said. Or, Brian said quietly, we could solve the real problem. What real problem? The hunger. His voice was gentle, understanding. I know you all feel it. It's getting worse, isn't it? The pain? It was. God help me, it was. My stomach felt like it was full of broken glass, and every step sent waves of agony through my entire body. I can make it stop, Brian continued. I can show you how to feed properly, how to really satisfy that craving. What are you talking about? Sarah whispered. Brian stepped closer, and in the flashlight beam his eyes gleamed with predatory patience. You know what I'm talking about. Deep down, you all know. The hunger isn't for food anymore. It's for something fresher. You're sick, Jennifer said, but her voice was uncertain. Am I? Brian smiled, and this time I saw the two sharp teeth. Or am I the only one being honest? Tell me you haven't thought about it. Tell me you haven't looked at each other and wondered what you would taste like. The horrible thing was, he was right. The thought had crossed my mind. A flash of imagination so vivid and revolting that I'd immediately tried to suppress it. But it had been there. Sarah's injured, Brian continued conversationally. Weak. It would be a kindness, really. Stop, I warned. Think about it logically. 3 of us could survive on 1, and she's already so close to giving up. Sarah made a small, terrified sound. That's enough. I lunged at Brian, but he sidestepped with impossible speed. My momentum carried me past him, and I stumbled into the darkness beyond our light. When I turned back, Brian was standing over Sarah, his hand extended toward her in a gesture of help. Come on, he said gently. Let me help you up. Sarah stared at his hand for a long moment. Then, slowly, she reached for it. Don't, I shouted. Too late. Brian's fingers closed around Sarah's wrist and she screamed. His grip tightened with audible wet sounds, and I realized his fingernails were extending again, puncturing her skin. Jennifer brought the heavy flashlight down on Brian's wrist with all her strength. There was a crack like breaking bone, and he released Sarah, staggering back. Run! I yelled. We scattered again, but this time I grabbed Sarah's hand and held on. Jennifer stayed close, her flashlight creating a small sphere of safety as we stumbled through the trees. Behind us, something howled. It started as Brian's voice calling our names in pain and confusion, but it rose in pitch and volume until it became something inhuman, a sound that seemed to come from every direction at once. There, Jennifer gasped, pointing ahead. Light! Real light this time. The steady glow of electric bulbs, not the flickering warmth of a campfire. Through the trees, I could see a building. A ranger station, maybe, or another campground. We ran toward it, crashing through underbrush, not caring about the noise. Behind us, the howling grew closer, and I could hear something large moving through the forest at incredible speed. The building was a maintenance shed, locked and empty. But there was a road, an actual paved road, leading away into the darkness. Which way? Sarah panted. I tried to remember the route we'd taken to reach the trailhead. Left, I think, downhill. We started running down the road, our footsteps echoing off the asphalt. The sound was reassuringly normal after hours of uncertain forest floor. That's when the headlights appeared ahead of us. A pickup truck rounded the curve, moving slowly. We flagged it down frantically, and the driver, a middle-aged man in a flannel shirt, rolled down his window. "You folks okay?" he asked. "Kinda late to be out here." "Please," Jennifer gasped. "We need help. Our friend, he's sick," I interrupted. "We need to get to a hospital." The man studied our faces, taking in our obvious terror and Sarah's injuries. "Hop in the back. I'll take you to town." We climbed into the truck bed, huddling together as the vehicle started moving. For the first time in hours, I felt like we might actually escape. That's when I heard Brian's voice calling from the forest. "Guys, wait up. Where are you going?" He emerged from the tree line, looking completely normal again. Tired, confused, but undeniably human. No claws, no reflecting eyes, no impossible smile. "Stop the truck," he called to the driver. "My friends are leaving without me." The truck began to slow. "No." I hammered on the rear window. "Don't stop. Keep driving." But the driver was already pulling over. "That your friend?" Brian jogged up to the truck, slightly out of breath but smiling with relief. "Thanks for stopping. I got turned around back there. Thought I'd lost them for good." "No problem," the driver said. "Climb in." "He's not our friend," Sarah whispered urgently. "Please, you have to believe us." But Brian was already climbing into the truck bed, settling himself across from us with that familiar, friendly smile. "Long night, huh, guys?" he said cheerfully. "Good thing this gentleman came along." The truck started moving again, carrying us down the mountain road toward civilization. In the darkness of the truck bed, Brian's eyes caught the occasional passing streetlight and reflected it back like a cat's. He leaned close to my ear and whispered, "You can't run forever, Michael. And when you finally stop, I'll be right here waiting." The hunger was still there, gnawing at my insides. But now I understood what it really was. Not starvation, transformation. The thing that had taken Brian was trying to take us too, one hunger pang at a time. As the truck carried us through the night, I made a decision. Whatever happened next, I wouldn't let it win. I couldn't let it spread beyond these mountains. But first, I had to figure out how to kill something that wore my best friend's face. The truck driver dropped us at the emergency room in Cumberland, 30 miles from Green Ridge. We told the doctors that Brian had suffered some kind of breakdown in the woods, that he might be dangerous. They sedated him and put him under observation while they treated Sarah's injuries. For 12 hours, he was perfectly normal, confused about his episode, apologetic, concerned for our well-being. The psychological evaluation found no signs of mental illness. The blood work came back clean. They released him the next afternoon. That night, 3 people disappeared from downtown Cumberland. A homeless man, a late-shift nurse, and a college student walking home from a bar. They were found a week later in the woods near Green Ridge, their bodies partially consumed and arranged in a circle around what looked like a ritual site. The police called it a cult killing. They never found the perpetrator. I know better. I've been hunting it for 6 months now. The thing that wears Brian's face, that speaks with his voice, that remembers our shared history with perfect clarity. It's careful now, never staying in one place long enough to establish a pattern. But it's still hungry. It's always hungry. And sometimes, in the middle of the night, I feel hungry too. Not for food, for something fresher, something that screams and struggles and pleads for mercy. When that happens, I know it's getting closer to taking me completely. I have maybe a month left before I become like Brian, before I start hunting the people I once called friends. The Wendigo spirit, the thing the ranger warned us about, doesn't just kill, it converts. It spreads. Jennifer and Sarah think I'm suffering from PTSD. They've tried to help, tried to get me therapy, tried to convince me that Brian really did have a psychotic break and that the rest was just my traumatized imagination filling in supernatural explanations for natural events. They don't understand that the hunger is real. They don't understand that it's growing stronger. Sometimes I catch myself looking at them and wondering what they would taste like. When that day comes, when the hunger finally wins, I want there to be a record. I want someone to know what really happened in Green Ridge State Forest and what's still happening. The Wendigo is patient. It can wait decades between feedings, existing on the occasional hiker or camper who ventures too deep into its territory. But when it finds a group like ours, close friends with strong bonds, it doesn't just feed, it reproduces. If you're reading this, it means I've lost the fight. It means I've become something that wears my face and speaks with my voice but hungers for human flesh. It means the Wendigo now has 2 agents instead of 1. Don't come looking for us. Don't try to help Brian or the thing that used to be me. Just stay away from Green Ridge State Forest, especially the area around Devil's Backbone Ridge. And if someone you know goes camping there and comes back wrong, if they smile too much, eat too little and make you feel hungry just by being near them, run. Run, and don't look back. The hunger is spreading. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of Savage River State Forest in western Maryland, during what was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip that turned into something I still can't fully explain or forget. I should start by saying that I've never been one to believe in ghost stories or folklore. I'm a practical guy, an accountant from Baltimore who spends most of his time behind a desk, crunching numbers and living a pretty ordinary life. But what happened to me and my 3 closest friends in those woods challenged everything I thought I knew about the world. It was October 2023, and the 4 of us, myself, Daniel Lopez, Christopher Hernandez, and Brandon Edwards, had decided we needed a break from our mundane office lives. We'd been friends since college, and though we'd talked about going camping for years, we'd never actually done it. Daniel, who worked in marketing, had been the most enthusiastic about the idea. He'd researched different locations for weeks before settling on Savage River State Forest. "It's perfect," he'd said, spreading maps across his kitchen table. "Remote, beautiful, and there are barely any other campers this time of year. We'll have the place to ourselves." Christopher, a software developer, had been more skeptical. "Are you sure we want to go somewhere that isolated? What if something happens?" "What's going to happen?" Brandon had laughed. Brandon worked in sales and had always been the most confident of our group, sometimes to a fault. "We're not exactly extreme adventurers. We're camping for 2 nights, not climbing Everest." That confidence of his would prove to be dangerously misplaced. We drove out on a Friday afternoon in late October, taking Daniel's SUV since it had the most space for our gear. None of us were experienced campers, but we'd bought what we thought we needed: a 4-person tent, sleeping bags, a camp stove, and enough food for the weekend. The plan was simple: hike to a remote campsite near Poplar Lick Run, set up camp, and spend the weekend disconnected from the digital world. The drive to the forest took about 3 hours from Baltimore. As we got deeper into the mountains of Garrett County, the cell phone signal grew weaker until it disappeared entirely. The roads became narrower, winding through dense forests of oak and maple trees that had turned brilliant shades of red and gold. It was beautiful, but there was something unsettling about how quickly civilization disappeared behind us. "Jesus, it's really out here," Christopher muttered, looking out at the endless trees. "That's the point," Daniel replied from the driver's seat. "When's the last time any of us were somewhere we couldn't check our phones?" We parked at the trailhead around 5 in the evening. The parking area was empty except for one other vehicle, a beat-up pickup truck that looked like it had been there for a while. Dead leaves had collected around the tires and the windshield was covered in a thin layer of dust. "Looks like we're not completely alone," I observed. "Probably just some local hunter," Brandon said, shouldering his pack. "Come on, let's get moving. We want to set up camp before dark." The trail to our intended campsite was supposed to be about 3 miles, following Poplar Lick Run upstream to a clearing Daniel had found marked on an old topographical map. The path was well-defined at first, marked with occasional white blazes on trees, but as we hiked deeper into the forest, it became less clear. The woods were unnaturally quiet. I'd expected to hear birds, rustling leaves, maybe the sound of small animals moving through the underbrush. Instead, there was only the soft crunch of our footsteps on fallen leaves and the distant sound of running water from the creek. "Is it just me, or is it really quiet out here?" Christopher asked after we'd been hiking for about an hour. "It's late in the season," Daniel replied, though I noticed he was looking around nervously. "Most animals are probably preparing for winter." But I knew what Christopher meant. The silence felt wrong, oppressive. Even the wind seemed muted, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. We reached the creek after about an hour and a half of hiking. Poplar Lick Run was a narrow stream, maybe 8 feet wide, running clear and cold over a bed of smooth stones. According to Daniel's map, we needed to follow it upstream for another mile to reach the campsite. That's when we noticed the first strange thing. "Hey," Brandon called from up ahead. "Come look at this." He was standing next to a large oak tree about 20 feet from the creek. Carved into the bark about 6 feet off the ground was a symbol I didn't recognize, a series of intersecting lines that formed an angular, almost geometric pattern. "What do you think that is?" Christopher asked. "Probably just some kids messing around," I suggested, but even as I said it, the carving didn't look like random graffiti. The lines were deep and deliberate, and there was something about the pattern that made me uncomfortable to look at. "It's old," Daniel said, running his finger along one of the carved lines. "This has been here for years." We found 2 more trees with similar carvings as we continued upstream. Each symbol was slightly different, but they all had the same angular, deliberate quality. They seemed to be marking something, though what, I couldn't guess. By the time we reached the clearing Daniel had found on his map, the sun was setting behind the mountains, casting long shadows between the trees. The campsite was perfect, a flat area about 50 feet from the creek, surrounded by towering hemlocks that would provide shelter from the wind. Under normal circumstances, I would have called it beautiful. But there was something off about the place. The silence was even more pronounced here, and the temperature seemed to drop noticeably as soon as we entered the clearing. More concerning were the bones. They were scattered around the edges of the clearing. Not human bones, thankfully, but the remains of various animals. Deer, rabbits, what looked like raccoons. Most were old and bleached white by weather, but some appeared fresher. "Jesus," Christopher muttered, kicking at a deer skull. "What happened here?" "Natural deaths," Brandon said quickly, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Animals die in the woods all the time." "Not like this," Daniel replied quietly. He was examining one of the deer skeletons more closely. "Look at these bones. They've been arranged." He was right. The bones weren't scattered randomly like you'd expect from natural predation or scavenging. They were laid out in deliberate patterns, almost like the carvings we'd seen on the trees. "Maybe we should find another campsite," Christopher suggested. "It's getting dark," I pointed out, "and we hiked 3 miles to get here. I'm not thrashing around in the woods with flashlights looking for another spot." "Mike's right," Brandon agreed. "Besides, what's the worst that could happen? Some local weirdo likes to arrange animal bones. So what?" We set up our tent in the center of the clearing, as far from the bone displays as possible. By the time we had camp established and dinner cooking on our little camp stove, full darkness had fallen. The only light came from our flashlights and the blue flame of the stove. That's when we heard the first howl. It came from somewhere deeper in the forest, a long, mournful sound that seemed to echo off the mountain sides. It wasn't like any wolf howl I'd ever heard in movies or documentaries. This was different, more guttural, with an almost human quality that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Was that a wolf?" Christopher asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "There aren't any wolves in Maryland," Daniel replied, but he was looking around nervously. "They were all killed off over a century ago." "Maybe it was a coyote," Brandon suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. The howl came again, closer this time, and definitely not from a coyote. There was something hungry in that sound, something that spoke to a primal fear buried deep in my brain. "Should we put out the stove?" I asked. "No," Daniel said quickly. "Light is good. Light keeps things away." But what things? None of us wanted to voice that question. We ate our dinner of instant noodles and canned chili in relative silence, starting at every small sound from the forest around us. When we finally crawled into our sleeping bags around 10 o'clock, I was exhausted, but too wound up to sleep. The tent felt fragile and inadequate, like it would provide no protection at all if something really wanted to get to us. I lay there listening to the breathing of my friends and the small sounds of the forest, wondering if we'd made a terrible mistake coming here. I must have dozed off eventually because I was awakened by Daniel shaking my shoulder. "Mike," he whispered urgently. "Wake up, something's wrong." I struggled out of my sleeping bag and checked my watch. It was 3:17 a.m. "What's wrong?" "Listen." I listened, and that's when I realized what had woken him. The forest was completely silent. Not just quiet, silent. No wind, no insects, no night birds, nothing. It was as if the entire wilderness was holding its breath. "Where's Brandon?" Christopher's voice came from across the tent. I turned on my flashlight and immediately saw that Brandon's sleeping bag was empty. The zipper was open, but not torn. It looked like he'd gotten out voluntarily. "Maybe he went to take a piss," I suggested, though my voice sounded hollow even to me. "Brandon," Daniel called out in a loud whisper. "Brandon, are you out there?" No response. "We need to find him," Christopher said, already pulling on his boots. We grabbed our flashlights and crawled out of the tent. The cold night air hit us immediately, and I realized the temperature had dropped significantly since we'd gone to sleep. Our breath came out in visible puffs, and frost was forming on the tent fly. "Brandon," I called out, louder this time. The beam of my flashlight swept across the clearing, illuminating the scattered bones and the dark wall of trees beyond. There was no sign of our friend. "Look," Daniel said, pointing his light at the ground near the tent. Footprints. Brandon's boot prints led away from the tent toward the creek, clearly visible in the frost-covered ground. But there was something wrong with them. The prints were perfectly spaced, too regular, like he'd been walking in a trance. "This way," Christopher said, following the trail. We tracked the footprints down to the creek where they disappeared at the water's edge. On the far side of the stream, we found them again, leading upstream into the deeper woods. "Why would he cross the creek?" I asked. "And why didn't he wake us up?" "Maybe he was sleepwalking," Daniel suggested, but none of us really believed that. Brandon had never been a sleepwalker. We crossed the creek, the icy water soaking through our boots and shocking us fully awake. The footprints continued on the other side, leading into a part of the forest where the trees grew so thick that our flashlight beams could barely penetrate 20 feet ahead. "Brandon!" we called out repeatedly, but our voices seemed to be swallowed by the darkness. We followed the trail for what felt like hours, though my watch said it had only been 30 minutes. The prints led us deeper and deeper into the woods, up steep slopes and through dense undergrowth that should have torn Brandon's clothes to shreds. But somehow, the footprints remained clear and consistent, as if he'd been floating just above the ground. That's when we found the clearing. It was larger than our campsite, roughly circular and completely bare of vegetation. The ground was packed earth, hard as concrete, and scattered around the perimeter were more of those bone arrangements we'd seen earlier. But these were different. Larger, more elaborate, and definitely not from local wildlife. Some of the bones were clearly human. "Jesus Christ," Christopher breathed. "What is this place?" In the center of the clearing stood a single tree, a massive oak that must have been centuries old. Its trunk was easily 8 feet in diameter, and its bare branches reached up into the darkness like gnarled fingers. Carved into the bark all around the trunk were hundreds of those same angular symbols we'd seen earlier, layer upon layer of them stretching from the ground to 20 feet up. And sitting at the base of the tree, perfectly still, was Brandon. He was alive, but something was terribly wrong. He sat with his back against the trunk, his legs crossed, his hands resting on his knees. His eyes were open, staring straight ahead, but he didn't react when we called his name or shined our lights on him. "Brandon!" Daniel ran toward him, but I grabbed his arm. "Wait," I said. "Something's not right." I was right to be cautious. As we watched, Brandon slowly turned his head to look at us. The movement was wrong. Too smooth, too controlled, like a puppet being manipulated by strings. And when the light hit his face, I saw that his eyes were completely black. Not just the pupils, but the entire eyes, as if they'd been filled with ink. "Hello, friends," Brandon said, but it wasn't Brandon's voice. It was deeper, colder, with an odd echoing quality that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. "Brandon, what's wrong with you?" Christopher took a step forward, but I held him back. "Brandon can't come to the phone right now," the thing wearing my friend's face replied. "He's busy, very busy. But don't worry, you'll be joining him soon." That's when the howling started again, but this time it was coming from all around us. Not one voice, but dozens, circling the clearing in the darkness beyond our flashlight beams. And underneath the howling was another sound, the crack of breaking branches, as if large things were moving through the forest toward us. "Run," I whispered. "We can't leave Brandon," Daniel protested. "That's not Brandon anymore," I said, backing toward the edge of the clearing. "Look at him." The thing in Brandon's body had started to smile, but the expression was all wrong. The smile was too wide, stretching Brandon's mouth in ways that should have been impossible. And when it opened its mouth, I caught a glimpse of teeth that were too sharp, too numerous. "You can't leave," it said. "The Wendigo is hungry. It's been so very hungry for so long, and now it has 4 fresh meals." The word hit me like a physical blow. Wendigo. I'd heard the term before in old Native American folklore, a creature of insatiable hunger that had once been human but had been transformed by cannibalism and starvation into something monstrous. "There's no such thing as," Christopher started to say, but his words were cut off by a sound that made my blood freeze. Something was moving in the trees around us. Something big. The branches were swaying and creaking, and I could hear the heavy thud of footsteps on the frozen ground. But what terrified me most was the breathing. Deep, ragged gasps that sounded like they were coming from lungs the size of barrels. "Run," I said again, and this time I didn't wait for the others. I turned and sprinted toward the tree line, my flashlight beam dancing wildly ahead of me. Behind me, I heard Daniel and Christopher following, their heavy breathing and pounding footsteps mixing with the sounds of pursuit from the darkness. The thing that had been Brandon called out after us, but its voice had changed again. Now it sounded like Brandon, pleading and desperate. "Wait! Guys, wait! Help me! Something's wrong with me. I can't move. Please don't leave me." I almost stopped. The voice was so perfectly Brandon, so full of terror and confusion that every instinct told me to go back and help my friend. But I remembered those black eyes, that impossible smile, and I kept running. We crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at our clothes and faces. Behind us, the howling grew louder, closer, and I could hear heavy footsteps gaining on us. Whatever was chasing us was fast, much faster than we were. "The creek!" Daniel shouted from somewhere to my left. "We need to get back to the creek." I had no idea which direction the creek was. In our panic, we'd become completely turned around. The forest seemed to shift and change around us, paths that should have led one way suddenly dead-ending at impassable thickets or steep drop-offs. That's when I realized what was happening. The thing wasn't just chasing us, it was herding us, driving us deeper into the woods, away from any hope of escape. "This way," Christopher called out from ahead, but when I followed his voice I found him standing at the edge of another clearing, this one filled with more bone arrangements and carved trees. "We're going in circles," Daniel panted, stumbling up beside us. He was right. Somehow, despite running in what I thought was a straight line away from the oak tree, we'd ended up in another part of the same cursed forest. The symbols were everywhere now, carved into every tree, and the ground was littered with bones, both animal and human. "It's playing with us," I realized. "It's not trying to catch us, it's enjoying the hunt." The howling had stopped, and the forest had returned to that unnatural silence. But I could feel eyes watching us from the darkness, could sense a presence circling just beyond the reach of our flashlights. "What do we do?" Christopher asked, his voice shaking. Before I could answer, Brandon stepped out of the trees directly in front of us. But it wasn't the same Brandon we'd found at the oak tree. This Brandon looked normal. His eyes were their usual brown, his expression was confused and frightened, and there was no sign of that horrible smile. "Guys," he said, running toward us. "Thank God you found me. I don't know what happened. I woke up and I was sitting by this tree and I couldn't move, and there was this voice in my head telling me things and—" "Stop," I said, raising my hand. "Don't come any closer." "What?" "Mike, it's me. It's Brandon. Look, I know something weird happened, but I'm okay now. We need to get out of here. There's something in these woods, something that—" "Prove it," I interrupted. "If you're really Brandon, Tell me something only he would know." Brandon looked hurt and confused. "What are you talking about? Of course I'm Brandon. You guys are scaring me. What happened to my eyes? Why are you looking at me like that?" But here's the thing. He couldn't tell me anything only Brandon would know. When I asked him about our college roommate's nickname, or the name of the bar where we always went for Daniel's birthday, or the embarrassing thing that happened to Christopher at my wedding, he couldn't answer. He looked confused, frustrated, like the information was just out of reach. "You're not him," I said, backing away. The false Brandon's expression began to change. The confusion melted away, replaced by something cold and predatory. "You're smarter than I gave you credit for," it said, and once again the voice was wrong, too deep, with that echoing quality. "Most humans are so easy to fool. You want to believe so badly that your friend is safe." "Where is he?" Daniel demanded. "What did you do with Brandon?" "Brandon is gone," the creature replied. "Consumed. His memories, his personality, his very essence, all feeding the hunger. But don't worry, soon you'll join him and then the feast will be complete." The thing wearing Brandon's face began to change. Its limbs stretched and elongated, its fingers extending into razor-sharp claws. Its mouth opened wider than any human mouth could, revealing rows of yellowed, pointed teeth. The skin on its face split and peeled away, showing something gray and mottled underneath. But the worst part was that it still looked like Brandon. Even as it transformed into something monstrous, it retained enough of my friend's features to be recognizable. It was like watching someone I cared about being turned inside out. "Run," I whispered, and this time we all moved together. We crashed through the forest again, but this time we had a plan. Daniel had managed to keep track of our general direction, and he was leading us back toward where we thought the creek might be. Behind us, I could hear the creature following, but it wasn't rushing. It was taking its time, confident that we couldn't escape. That confidence was well placed. Every path we took seemed to lead us back to another clearing filled with bones and symbols. The forest itself seemed to be working against us, shifting and changing to trap us in an endless maze of horror. We ran for what felt like hours, our energy slowly draining away. Our flashlight batteries were dying, the beams growing dimmer with each passing minute. Christopher was wheezing badly. He'd never been in good shape, and the cold air and exertion were taking their toll. "I can't. Keep going," he gasped, stumbling to his knees. "You have to," Daniel urged, trying to pull him to his feet. "It's still out there. Maybe if we give it what it wants." Christopher looked back the way we'd come, his eyes wild with exhaustion and fear. "No," I said firmly. "We stick together. We all get out of this, or none of us do." But even as I said it, I was starting to doubt whether any of us would make it out alive. The creature was playing with us, wearing us down, waiting for us to collapse from exhaustion. And then what? Would it kill us quickly, or would it do to us what it had done to Brandon? That's when we heard the gunshot. It was distant but unmistakable, a sharp crack that echoed through the mountains. Then another, and another. "Someone's out there," Daniel said excitedly. "Hunters, maybe, or park rangers." We changed direction, following the sound of the shots. The creature behind us had gone silent, and I wondered if it was afraid of other humans, or if it was simply confident that they wouldn't be able to help us. We found the source of the shots about 10 minutes later, a small cabin tucked into a hollow between two ridges. Light flickered in the windows and smoke rose from a stone chimney. It looked like something out of a fairy tale, too perfect and welcoming to be real. "Could be a trap," I said. "Or it could be our only chance," Daniel replied. A figure emerged from the cabin as we approached, an elderly man in hunting clothes carrying a rifle. He was tall and lean, with a thick white beard and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "You boys look like you've seen a ghost," he said, his voice carrying a slight mountain accent. "Please," Christopher gasped, "we need help. Our friend. Something took our friend." The old man's expression grew serious. "Something? What kind of something?" "We don't know," I said. "It looked like him, but it wasn't him. It had black eyes and too many teeth, and it could change its shape." The man nodded grimly. "Wendigo. I've been tracking this one for 3 weeks. It killed a family of hikers up near Backbone Mountain, then disappeared into these woods." "You know about it?" Daniel asked. "Know about it? Son, I've been hunting these things for 40 years. My grandfather taught me and his grandfather taught him. There's more than one of them in these mountains, and they're getting bolder." He invited us into the cabin, which was warm and filled with the smell of coffee and wood smoke. The walls were covered with old photographs, newspaper clippings, and what looked like Native American artifacts. Several rifles hung above the fireplace. "The name's Frank Morrison," he said, pouring us each a cup of coffee. "I'm what you might call a specialist in unusual predators." "Is our friend really dead?" Christopher asked quietly. Frank's expression was sympathetic but honest. "If the Wendigo has had him for more than a few hours, then yes. I'm sorry. These things don't take prisoners. They consume their victims completely, body and soul." The news hit us hard, but somehow I'd already known. The thing we'd encountered in the clearing hadn't been Brandon-possessed or controlled. It had been something else entirely, something that had devoured my friend and was wearing his form like a costume. "How do we kill it?" I asked. Frank raised an eyebrow. "Most people in your situation would be asking how to get away from it, not how to kill it." "It murdered our friend," Daniel said grimly. "It needs to die." Frank studied us for a moment, then nodded. "Fair enough. Wendigos are tough, but they're not invincible. Silver bullets work, but only if you hit the heart or the head. Fire is even better. They're afraid of it, and it's one of the few things that can destroy them completely." He showed us his ammunition, bullets with silver tips, specially crafted for hunting supernatural predators. He also had a collection of incendiary devices, basically homemade firebombs that he said he'd used to destroy Wendigo lairs in the past. "The tricky part is getting close enough to use them," he explained. "Wendigos are cunning. They like to separate their prey, pick them off one by one, but they're also proud. If you challenge one directly, it won't be able to resist. That's how we came up with our plan." Frank would lead us back to the clearing where we'd first encountered the creature, the one with the oak tree and the bone arrangements. The Wendigo would be there, waiting for us. He was certain of that. We would challenge it to face us directly, then hit it with everything we had. "Are you sure about this?" Frank asked as we prepared to leave the cabin. "You boys aren't trained for this kind of thing." "We're sure," I replied, though in truth I was terrified. But Brandon had been my friend since college. I couldn't just run away and leave his killer unpunished. We set out just before dawn, following Frank through the forest. He moved through the woods like he'd been born there, never hesitating at trail junctions or difficult terrain. Within an hour, we were back at the clearing where our nightmare had begun. The creature was waiting for us. It stood in the center of the clearing, next to the oak tree, but it was no longer wearing Brandon's form. Instead, it had taken its true shape, a gaunt, humanoid figure nearly 8 feet tall, with gray, mottled skin stretched tight over a skeletal frame. Its fingers ended in black claws, and its face was a horrific blend of human and animal features. But the worst part was its eyes. Not the solid black we'd seen earlier, but a swirling mass of darkness that seemed to pull at your sanity if you stared too long. "You brought friends," it said, its voice echoing from the surrounding trees as well as its mouth. "How thoughtful. More food for the hunger." "This ends here," Frank called out, raising his rifle. "You've killed your last victim, monster." The Wendigo laughed, a sound like breaking glass mixed with screaming wind. "Old man, do you think your little toys can hurt me? I have fed on the flesh and souls of hundreds. I am eternal. I am hunger itself." "We'll see about that," Frank replied and fired. The silver bullet took the creature in the chest, spinning it around and knocking it to the ground. Black blood spattered the oak tree behind it, and for a moment I thought we'd won. But the Wendigo rose to its feet, the wound already beginning to heal. "My turn," It snarled and moved faster than anything that size had a right to move. Frank got off one more shot before the creature reached him. The bullet took it in the shoulder but didn't slow it down. Razor-sharp claws raked across Frank's chest, opening deep wounds that immediately began to bleed. Daniel and Christopher opened fire with the extra rifles Frank had given us, but our aim was wild. Only one bullet found its mark, catching the Wendigo in the leg and causing it to stumble. That stumble saved Frank's life. He rolled away from the creature's next attack and came up with one of his incendiary devices. "Get back!" he shouted, pulling the pin. The firebomb exploded against the Wendigo's chest, covering it in burning chemicals. The creature's scream of pain and rage was unlike anything I'd ever heard, a sound that seemed to come from the deepest pits of hell itself. But even as it burned, it kept fighting. It lunged toward Christopher, who was closest, its claws extended to tear out his throat. I didn't think, I just acted. I threw myself between them and felt the creature's claws rake across my back. The pain was indescribable, like being hit with red-hot poker, but it gave Christopher time to get away. Frank was back on his feet, despite his wounds, loading another incendiary device. "Keep it distracted," he shouted. We kept firing, using up our ammunition, while Frank prepared his final assault. The Wendigo was weakening. The fire had done significant damage, and our bullets had taken their toll. But it was still deadly, still fast enough to kill any of us if we gave it an opening. "This is for Brandon," Daniel screamed, charging the creature with an empty rifle, using it like a club. The Wendigo caught the rifle and snapped it in half, then backhanded Daniel across the clearing. He hit a tree hard and didn't get up. That's when Frank made his move. He ran straight at the burning creature, his second firebomb in his hands. The Wendigo saw him coming and tried to dodge, but its injuries had slowed it down. Frank tackled it around the waist, driving both of them to the ground. "Burn in hell!" Frank shouted and activated the device. The explosion lit up the entire clearing. Frank and the Wendigo disappeared in a ball of fire that rose 20 feet into the air. The heat was so intense that Christopher and I had to retreat to the tree line. When the flames finally died down, there was nothing left but ash and the charred remains of the oak tree. Both Frank and the Wendigo were gone, consumed completely by the fire. We found Daniel unconscious but alive, with a concussion and several broken ribs. Christopher and I were both wounded but mobile. We helped Daniel back to Frank's cabin, where we found his truck keys and drove ourselves to the nearest hospital. The official story was that we'd been attacked by a bear. Daniel and I both required surgery for our injuries, and we spent several days in the hospital. Christopher got away with just stitches and some bruising. We never told anyone the truth about what happened in those woods. Who would believe us? 3 city guys with a story about a cannibalistic monster? They'd have locked us up in a psychiatric ward. But we knew the truth. Brandon was dead, killed by something that shouldn't exist but did. Frank Morrison had died a hero, saving our lives and destroying a creature that had terrorized those mountains for who knows how long. The hardest part was telling Brandon's family. We stuck to the bear story, said their son had been killed in a tragic accident while camping. His body was never found, which wasn't unusual for bear attacks in remote wilderness areas. The search and rescue teams found some torn clothing and bloodstains, which was enough for them to declare him dead. I still think about that weekend sometimes, especially when I'm alone at night. I wonder if there are more creatures like that Wendigo out there, hiding in the deep woods, waiting for unsuspecting hikers and campers. I wonder if Frank Morrison was part of some secret group that hunted these things, and if someone else has taken over his duties now that he's gone. Mostly, though, I think about Brandon, not the thing that wore his face in those final hours, but my real friend, the guy who always had a joke ready, who never missed a birthday or important event, who convinced us to take that camping trip in the first place because he thought we needed an adventure. He got his adventure, just not the kind any of us had bargained for. I've never been camping since then. None of us have. Daniel moved to California a few months after the incident, and Christopher has been seeing a therapist to deal with what he calls his wilderness anxiety. We still keep in touch, but we never talk about what really happened that weekend. Sometimes I get the urge to go back to those woods, to see if the clearing is still there, if the symbols carved into the trees have faded. But I know better. Some places are meant to be left alone, and some secrets are better left buried. The mountains of western Maryland are beautiful this time of year, with the leaves changing colors and the air crisp and clean. But I know what can be hiding in those deep, dark woods, and I'll never be foolish enough to go looking for it again. The hunger is still out there, somewhere, waiting for the next group of unsuspecting campers who think they know what they're getting into, but they have no idea what's waiting for them in the darkness between the trees.